Academy of Sciences of the USSR. Institute of Economics. Political Economy. Textbook. State Publishing House of Political Literature. Moscow 1954. 3. 4. Contents. Preface. 16. Introduction. 17. Political economy is one of the social sciences. It studies the laws of social production and distribution of material goods at various stages of the development of human society. 17. Chapter I. The primitive communal mode of production. 28. The emergence of human society. 28. Conditions of material life. Development of tools. 30. Production relations of primitive society. Natural division of labor. 33. Tribal system. Matriarchal gens. Patriarchal gens. 35. The emergence of the social division of labor and exchange. 38. The emergence of private property and classes. Disintegration of the primitive communal system. 39. Social conceptions of the primitive epoch. 42. Brief conclusions. 44. Chapter 2. The slaveholding mode of production. 45. Emergence of the slaveholding system. 45. Production relations of the slaveholding system. The status of slaves. 50. Further development of the exchange, trade and usurious capital. 55. Aggravation of the contradictions of the slaveholding mode of production. 57. The class struggle of the exploited against the exploiters. Slave revolts. The death of the slaveholding system. 59. Economic views of the slave era. 61. Brief conclusions. 65. Chapter 3. The feudal mode of production. 67. The emergence of feudalism. 67. Production relations of feudal society. Exploitation of peasants by feudal lords. 72. Medieval city. Artisans' guilds. Merchant guilds. 77. Classes and estates of feudal society. Feudal hierarchy. 81. Development of productive forces of feudal society. 83. 5. The origin of capitalist production in the depths of the feudal system. The role of merchant capital. 85. Initial accumulation of capital. Forcible dispossession of peasants. Accumulation of wealth. 90. Uprisings of serfs. Bourgeois revolutions. The death of the feudal system. The death of the feudal system. 95. Economic views of the feudalistic era. 97. Brief conclusions. 105. Section 2. The capitalist mode of production. 108. A. Pre-monopoly capitalism. 108. Chapter IV. Commodity, production, goods, and money. 109. Commodity production is the starting point of the emergence and the general feature of capitalism. 109. The product and its properties. The dual character of labor embodied in the commodity. 110. Simple and complex work, socially necessary working time. 114. Development of forms of value. The essence of money. 116. Functions of money. 119. Gold and paper money. 125. The law of value is the economic law of commodity production. 127. Commodity fetishism. 129. Brief conclusions. 130. Chapter V. Capitalist, simple, cooperation, and manufacture. 133. Capitalist simple cooperation. 133. The manufacturing period of capitalism. 135. Capitalist work at home. 139. The historical role of the manufactory. 140. Disintegration of the peasantry. Transition from corvée to capitalist farming. 141. Formation of an internal market for capitalist industry. 145. Brief conclusions. 146. Chapter V. The machine age of capitalism. 148. Transition from manufacture to machine industry. 148. The Industrial Revolution. 149. Capitalist industrialization. 153. Growth of cities and industrial centers. The formation of a proletarian class. 156. 6. Capitalist factory. Machine as a means of exploitation of wage labor by capital. 158. Large-scale industry and agriculture. 162. Capitalist socialization of labor and production. The limits of the use of machines under capitalism. 164. Brief conclusions. 166. Chapter 7. Capital and surplus value. The basic Economic law of capitalism. 169. The basis of the relations of production of the capitalist system. 169. The transformation of money into capital. Labor power as a commodity. 171. The value and use value of labor power. The law of surplus value is the basic law of capitalism. 173. Capital as a social relation of production. Constant and variable capital. 178. The rate of surplus value. 180. Two ways to increase exploitation. Absolute and relative surplus value. 182. The working day and its boundaries. The struggle for a shorter working day. 184. Excess surplus value. 187. The class structure of capitalist society. The bourgeois state. 189. Brief conclusions. 192. Chapter 8. Wages. 194. The price of labor. The essence of wages. 194. Basic forms of wages. 196. Sweatshop wage systems. 201. Nominal and real wages. 204. Falling real wages under capitalism. 207. The struggle of the working class for higher wages. 212. Brief conclusions. 214. Chapter IX. The accumulation of capital and the impoverishment of the proletariat. 216. Production and reproduction. 216. Capitalist simple reproduction. 217. Capitalist expanded reproduction. Capital accumulation. 220. Organic composition of capital. Concentration and centralization of capital. 221. Industrial Reserve Army. 224. 7. Agrarian overpopulation. 227. The universal law of capitalist accumulation. The relative and absolute impoverishment of the proletariat. 229. The fundamental contradiction of the capitalist mode of production. 232. Brief conclusions. 233. Chapter X. Circulation and turnover of capital. 235. Circulation of capital. Three forms of industrial capital. 235. Capital turnover. Production time and circulation time. 239. Fixed and working capital. 240. The annual rate of surplus value. Ways to accelerate the turnover of capital. 243. Brief conclusions. 246. Chapter 11. Average, profit, and price of production. 247. Capitalist costs of production and profit. Profit margin. 247. The formation of the average rate of profit and the transformation of the value of commodities into the price of production. 250. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall. 257. Brief conclusions. 260. Chapter 12. Commerce, credit, and the circulation of money. 262. Trading profit and its source. 262. Circulation costs. 265. Forms of capitalist trade. Commodity exchanges. 267. Foreign trade. 268. Loan capital. 270. Interest and entrepreneurial income. The rate of interest and its tendency to fall. 272. Forms of credit. Banks and their operations. 273. Joint stock companies. Fictitious capital. 278. The money circulation of the capitalist countries. 281. Brief conclusions. 284. Chapter 13. Ground, rent, agrarian, relations, under capitalism. 286. The capitalist system of agriculture and private ownership of land. 286. Differential rent. 289. Absolute rent. The price of land. 294. Rent in the mining industry. Rent for building plots. 298. Large-scale and small-scale production in agriculture. 300. Deepening the opposition between town and country. 304. 8. Private ownership of land and nationalization of land. 305. Brief conclusions. 308. Chapter 14. National income. 310. Total social product and national income. 310. Distribution of national income. 312. State budget. 318. Brief conclusions. 321. Chapter 15. The reproduction of social capital. 323. Social capital. Composition of the total social product. 323. Conditions of realization under capitalist simple reproduction. 326. Conditions of realization under capitalist expanded reproduction. 328. Brief conclusions, 333. Chapter 16, Economic Crises, 335. The basis of the capitalist crises of overproduction, 335. The cyclical character of capitalist reproduction, 339. Agrarian crises, 342. Crises and sharpening of the contradictions of capitalism, 344. The historical tendency of the development of capitalism. The proletariat as the gravedigger of capitalism, 348. Brief conclusions, 350. B. Monopoly capitalism, imperialism, 352. Chapter 17. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the basic economic law of monopoly capitalism, 353. Transition to imperialism, 353. Concentration of production and monopoly. Monopolies and competition, 357. Financial capital and financial oligarchy, 364. Export of capital, 366. The economic division of the world between the capitalist unions. International monopolies, 369. Completion of the territorial division of the world between the great powers and the struggle for its redivision, 370. The basic economic law of monopoly capitalism, 373. Brief conclusions, 379. Chapter 18. The colonial system of imperialism, 381. The role of the colonies in the period of imperialism, 381. Colonies as agrarian and raw material appendages of the metropolises, 383. 9. Methods of colonial exploitation of the working masses, 388. The national liberation struggle of the colonial peoples, 393. Brief conclusions, 396. Chapter 19. The historical place of imperialism, 398. Imperialism is the last stage of capitalism, 398. Imperialism is parasitic or decaying capitalism, 400. Imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution, 405. State monopoly capitalism, 406. The law of the unevenness of the economic and political development of the capitalist countries in the period of imperialism and the possibility of the victory of socialism in one country, 409. Brief conclusions, 414. Chapter XX. The general crisis of capitalism, 416. The essence of the general crisis of capitalism, 416. The First World War and the beginning of the general crisis of capitalism, 418. The victory of the Great October Socialist Revolution and the split of the world into two systems, capitalist and socialist, 421. The crisis of the colonial system of imperialism, 425. Aggravation of the problem of markets, chronic underutilization of enterprises and chronic mass unemployment, 428. Deepening crises of overproduction and changes in the capitalist cycle, 431. Brief conclusions, 437. Chapter 21. The deepening of the general crisis of capitalism after the Second World War, 439. The Second World War and the second stage of the general crisis of capitalism, 439. The formation of two camps in the international arena and the collapse of the single world market, 444. The aggravation of the crisis of the colonial system of imperialism, 446. Intensification of the unevenness of the development of capitalism. The expansion of U.S. imperialism, 450. Militarization of the economies of capitalist countries, 455. The intensification of the impoverishment of the working class in the capitalist countries, 458. The degradation of agriculture in the capitalist countries and the ruin of the peasantry. 461. Brief conclusions, 465. 10. Economic doctrines of the epoch of capitalism, 467. Bourgeois classical political economy, 467. The emergence of vulgar political economy, 472. Petty bourgeois political economy, 474. Utopian socialists, 475. Revolutionary Democrats in Russia, 476. The revolutionary upheaval in political economy accomplished by K. Marx and F. Engels, 478. Further disintegration of bourgeois economics, modern bourgeois political economy, 484. The economic theories of the opportunists of the Second International and of the modern right socialists, 492. The development of the Marxist political economy of capitalism by V. I. Lenin. The elaboration of a number of new principles of the political economy of capitalism by J. V. Stalin. 498. Section 3. The socialist mode of production. 509. The transition period from capitalism to socialism. 509. Chapter 22. The main features of the transition period from capitalism to socialism. 510. The proletarian revolution and the necessity of the transition period from capitalism to socialism. 510. The dictatorship of the proletariat as an instrument for building a socialist economy. 513. Socialist nationalization. 516. Economic structures and classes in the transition period. An alliance between the working class and the peasantry. 520. The emergence of the economic laws of socialism. 525. Fundamentals of economic policy in the period of transition from capitalism to socialism. 528. Brief conclusions. 539. Chapter 23. Socialist industrialization. 541. Large-scale industry is the material basis of socialism. The essence of socialist industrialization. 541. The pace of socialist industrialization. 546. The socialist method of industrialization. Sources of funds for socialist industrialization. 547. 11. The transformation of the USSR from a backward, agrarian country into an advanced, industrial power. 552. Brief conclusions. 558. Chapter 24. Collectivization of agriculture. 560. The historical necessity of collectivization of agriculture. Lenin's cooperative plan. 560. Prerequisites for complete collectivization. 565. Complete collectivization and liquidation of the kulaks as a class. 571. Agricultural artel as the main form of collective farming. 574. Transformation of the USSR from a country of small peasant farming into a country of the largest and most mechanized agriculture in the world. 576. Brief conclusions. 580. Chapter 25. The victory of socialism in the USSR. 582. Establishment of the socialist mode of production. 582. Changes in the class structure of society. 586. Elimination of economic inequality of nations. 593. The USSR enters the period of gradual transition from socialism to communism. 596. Brief conclusions. 600. B. The socialist system of the NATIONAOL economy. 602. Chapter 26. The material and productive basis of socialism. 603. The main features of the material and production base of socialism. 603. Socialist industry. 605. Socialist agriculture. 609. Paths of technological progress under socialism. 612. Place of socialist production. 618. Brief conclusions. 621. Chapter 27. Social ownership of the means of production as the basis of the relations of production of socialism. 623. The socialist system of the national economy and socialist property. The socialist system of the national economy and socialist property. 623. Two forms of socialist ownership. 626. Personal property. Personal property under socialism. 634. 12. The nature of socialist relations of production. 635. Brief conclusions. 639. Chapter 28. The basic economic law of socialism. 641. The nature of economic laws under socialism. 641. Essential features of the basic economic law of socialism. 645. The basic economic law of socialism and the growth of the welfare of the working people. 649. The economic role of the socialist state. 653. Brief conclusions. 657. Chapter 29. The law of planned, proportional development of the national economy. 660. The necessity of the planned development of the national economy under socialism. 660. The main features and requirements of the law of planned development of the national economy. 662. The law of planned development of the national economy and socialist planning. 667. Advantages of planned economy. 676. Brief conclusions. 678. Chapter XXX. Social. Labor. Under. Socialism. 680. The nature of labor under socialism. The principle of material interest. 680. Work as the duty of members of socialist society. Realization of the right to work. 682. Distribution according to labor is the economic law of socialism. 685. Socialist cooperatives of labor. 687. Socialist competition. 690. The steady growth of labor productivity is the economic law of socialism. 693. Brief conclusions. 698. Chapter 31. Commodity. Production. The law of value and money under socialism. 700. The necessity of commodity production under socialism and its peculiarities. 700. Use value and commodity value in the socialist economy. 703. The nature of the operation of the law of value under socialism. 707. Money and its functions in the socialist economy. 712. Brief conclusions. 715. 13. Chapter 32. Wages. Under socialism. 717. Wages and the economic law of labor distribution. 717. Forms of wages. Tariff system. 721. A steady rise in real wages under socialism. 727. Brief conclusions. 732. Chapter 33. Economic, accounting, and profitability, cost, and price. 735. Economy mode. 735. Economic accounting and profitability of enterprises. 736. Enterprise funds, fixed and revolving assets. 743. Cost of production. 746. Net income of a state-owned enterprise. Centralized net income of the state. 749. The price of industrial products. 753. Brief conclusions. 754. Chapter 34. The socialist system of agriculture. 756. The place and role of socialist agriculture in the national economy. 756. Machine and tractor stations are the industrial base of kolkhoz production. 763. Public economy of collective farms. Kolkhoz means of production. Workday. 769. Products of collective farm production. Kolkhoz income. 774. Differential rent under socialism. 780. Distribution of kolkhoz production and kolkhoz income. Growth of the well-being of the kolkhoz peasantry. 783. Development of state farms and ways to increase their profitability. 789. Brief conclusions. 794. Chapter 35. Commodity. Turnover. Under socialism. 796. The nature and role of trade under socialism. 796. The main forms of trade under socialism. 803. Prices and costs of circulation in state and cooperative trade. 806. Foreign trade. 810. Brief conclusions. 813. Chapter 36. The national income of a socialist society. 814. Total social product and national income under socialism. 814. A steady increase in national income under socialism. 817. Distribution of national income. 820. 14. Brief conclusions. 824. Chapter 37. The SSTATE. Budget, credit, and the circulation of money under socialism. 826. The financial system of socialism. 826. The budget of a socialist state. 827. Credit under socialism. 834. Banks in a socialist society. 838. Money circulation under socialism. 841. Brief conclusions. 845. Chapter 38. Socialist reproduction. 846. The essence of socialist reproduction. 846. The national wealth of socialist society. Composition of the total social product. 849. The relation between the two subdivisions of social production. 853. Formation and purpose of public funds under socialism. 858. Scheme of distribution of the total product in a socialist society. 860. Socialist accumulation, accumulation and consumption in socialist society. 861. Brief conclusions. 865. Chapter 39. The gradual transition from socialism to communism. 868. Two phases of communist society, 868. Creation of the material and production base of communism, 873. Ways of abolishing the essential distinction between town and country, 877. Ways of abolishing the essential distinction between mental and physical labor, 882. Transition to the communist principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, 886. Brief conclusions, 890. The building of socialism in the people's democracies, 893. Chapter XL. The economic system of the European people's democracies, 894. Prerequisites for the People's Democratic Revolution, 894. The nature of the People's Democratic Revolution, 896. Economic structures and classes, 900. 15. Socialist industrialization, 906. The socialist transformation of agriculture, 910. Growth of material well-being and culture of workers, 914. Brief conclusions, 917. Chapter XLI. The economic system of the People's Republic of China, 919. The economic prerequisites of the Chinese People's Revolution, 919. The character of the Chinese Revolution, 922. Revolutionary agrarian transformations, socialist nationalization, 925. Forms of ownership of the means of production and the class structure of society in the People's Republic of China, 927. The ways of China's socialist industrialization, 935. Gradual socialist transformation of agriculture, 940. Raising the material and cultural standard of living of the Chinese people, 945. Brief conclusions, 947. Chapter XLII. Economic cooperation of the countries of the socialist camp, 949. The emergence and strengthening of the global democratic market, 949. The nature of economic relations between the countries of the socialist camp, 952. The main forms of economic cooperation of the countries of the socialist camp, 957. Brief conclusions, 962. Conclusion, 964. 16. Preface. This textbook of political economy was written by a team of economists consisting of academician K. V. Ostrovityanov, corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, D. T. Shepilov, corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, A. Leontiev, full member of the All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences named after Lenin, I. D. Laptev, Professor, I. Kuzmanov, Doctor of Economics, L. M. Gatovsky, Academician, P. F. Udin, corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, I. Pashkov, candidate of Economic Sciences, V. I. Peresligin. The selection and processing of statistical materials included in the textbook was attended by Doctor of Economics V. N. Starovsky. In developing the draft textbook, many Soviet economists made valuable critical remarks and made a number of useful suggestions for the text. These comments and suggestions were taken into account by the authors in the subsequent work on the textbook. The November 1951 economic discussion organized by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was of great importance for the work on the textbook. The resulting proposals for improving the draft textbook were an important source for improving the structure of the textbook and enriching its content. The final revision of the textbook was carried out by comrades Ostrovityanov K. V. Shepilov D. T. Leontiev L. A. Laptev I. D. Kuzmanov I. Gatovsky L. M. Fully aware of the importance of the Marxist textbook of political economy, the authors intend to continue work on the further improvement of the text of the textbook on the basis of the critical remarks and wishes that will be made by readers after reading the first edition of the textbook. In this regard, the authors ask readers to send their feedback and suggestions on the textbook to the address Moscow, Volkhonka Street, 14, Institute of Economics of the USSR Academy of Sciences, authors. August 1954, Moscow. 17. Introduction. Political economy is one of the social sciences. 1. It studies the laws of social production and distribution of material goods at various stages of the development of human society. The basis of the life of society is material production. In order to live, people must have food, clothing, and other material goods. In order to have these goods, people must produce them, they must work. People produce material goods, that is, they fight against nature, not alone, but together, in groups, in societies. Consequently, production is always and under all conditions social production, and labor is the activity of social man. The process of production of material goods presupposes the following moments. 1. Human labor. 2. The subject of labor. And 3. The means of labor. Labor is the purposeful activity of man, in the process of which he modifies and adapts the objects of nature to satisfy his needs. Work is a natural necessity, an indispensable condition for human existence. Without work, human life itself would be impossible. The object of labor is everything to which man's labor is directed. Subjects of labor can be directly given by nature itself, for example, a tree that is cut down in the forest, or ore that is extracted from the bowels of the earth. Subjects of labor which have previously been exposed to labor, such as ore in a metallurgical plant, cotton in a spinning mill, are called raw materials. The instruments of labor are all those things by means of which man acts upon the object of his labor and modifies one. The name political economy comes from the Greek words politeia and oikonomy. The word politeia means social structure. The word oikonomia in turn consists of two words, oikos, house, household, and nomos, law. The name political economy appeared only at the beginning of the XX century. 18. The instruments of labor are, first of all, instruments of production, as well as land, industrial buildings, roads, canals, warehouses, etc. Instruments of production play a decisive role in the composition of the means of labor. These include the various tools that man uses in his labor activity, from the crude stone tools of primitive people to modern machines. The level of development of the instruments of production serves as a measure of society's power over it. Nature, a measure of the development of production. Economic epochs differ not in what is produced, but in how it is produced, by what instruments of production. The subjects of labor and instruments of labor constitute the means of production. The means of production in themselves, apart from connection with labor power, are only a heap of dead things. In order for the labor process to begin, labor power must be combined with the instruments of production. Labor power is man's ability to work, the totality of man's physical and spiritual forces, thanks to which he is able to produce material goods. Labor power is an active element of production, it sets in motion the means of production. With the development of the tools of production, the ability of man to work, his skills, and production experience also develop. The instruments of production with the help of which material goods are produced, the people who set these instruments in motion and carry out the production of material goods by means of a certain production experience and skills for work, constitute the productive forces of society. The toiling masses are the main productive force of human society at all stages of its development. The productive forces express the attitude of people to the objects and forces of nature used for the production of material goods. However, in production, people affect not only nature, but also each other. They cannot produce without uniting in a certain way for joint activity and for the 19 mutual exchange of their activities. In order to produce, people enter into certain connections and relations, and it is only through these social ties and relations that their relation to nature exists. Production takes place. Two certain connections and relations of people in the process of production of material goods constitute relations of production. The nature of the relations of production depends on who owns the means of production, land, forests, waters, mineral resources, raw materials, instruments of production, production buildings, means of communication and communication, etc. In the ownership of individuals, social groups or classes who use these means to exploit the workers, or in the ownership of society, the purpose of which is to satisfy the material and cultural needs of the masses of the people, of the whole society. The state of the relations of production shows how the means of production are distributed among the members of society, and consequently also the material goods produced by men. Thus, the basis of the relations of production is a certain form of ownership of the means of production. The relations of production also determine the corresponding relations of distribution. Distribution is the link between production and consumption. The products produced in society serve industrial or personal consumption. Productive consumption refers to the use of the means of production to create material wealth. Personal consumption refers to the satisfaction of a person's needs for food, clothing, shelter, etc. The distribution of produced articles of personal consumption depends on the distribution of the means of production. In capitalist society, the means of production belong to the capitalists, and therefore the products of labor also belong to the capitalists. The workers are 2K. Marx, Wage, Labor and Capital, K. Marx, F. Engels, Selected Works, Volume I, 1948, page 63. 20 deprived of the means of production and, in order not to die of hunger, are forced to work for the capitalists, who appropriate the products of their labor. In a socialist society, the means of production are social property. In view of this, the products of labor belong to the workers themselves. In social formations where there is commodity production, the distribution of material goods is carried out through the exchange of commodities. Production, distribution, exchange, and consumption constitute a unity in which production plays a decisive role. The totality of the relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real basis on which the juridical and political superstructure rises and to which certain forms of social consciousness correspond. 3. Once born, the superstructure, in turn, exerts a reciprocal active influence on the base, accelerating or retarding its development. Production has a technical and social side. The technical side of production is studied by natural and technical sciences, physics, chemistry, metallurgy, mechanical engineering, agronomy, and others. Political economy studies the social side of production, the socio-productive, i.e., economic, relations of people. Political economy, wrote V. I. Lenin, is not at all concerned with production, but with the social relations of people in production, with the social system of production. 4. Political economy studies the relations of production in their interaction with the productive forces. The productive forces and the relations of production, in their unity, form the mode of production. 3. Marx, Preface to a Critique of Political Economy, K. Marx, F. Engels, Selected Works, Volume I, 1948, page 322, 4 V. I. Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Works, Volume 3, pp. 40-41. 21. The productive forces are the most mobile and revolutionary element of production. The development of production begins with changes in the productive forces, first of all, with the change and development of the instruments of production, and then there are corresponding changes in the sphere of production relations. People's relations of production, developing in dependence on the development of the productive forces, in their turn actively influence the productive forces. The productive forces of society can develop unhindered only if the relations of production correspond to the state of the productive forces. At a certain stage of their development, the productive forces outgrow the framework of the given relations of production and come into conflict with them. As a result, the old relations of production are sooner or later replaced by new relations of production, corresponding to the level of development achieved and the nature of the productive forces of society. As the economic basis of society changes, so does its superstructure. The material prerequisites for the replacement of the old relations of production by new ones arise and develop in the depths of the old formation. The new relations of production open up space for the development of the productive forces. Thus, the economic law of the development of society is the law of the obligatory correspondence of the relations of production to the character of the productive forces. In a society based on private property and the exploitation of man by man, the conflicts between the productive forces and the relations of production manifest themselves in the class struggle. Under these conditions, the replacement of the old mode of production by a new one is effected by means of a social revolution. Political economy is a historical science. It deals with material production in its historically determined social form, with the economic laws inherent in the corresponding. 22 modes of production. Economic laws express the essence of economic phenomena and processes, the internal, causal connection and dependence existing between them. Each mode of production has its own basic economic law. The basic economic law determines the main aspects, the essence of a given mode of production. Political economy investigates first of all the special laws of each separate stage in the development of production and exchange, and only at the end of this investigation can it establish a few, quite general, laws applicable to production and exchange in general. 5. Consequently, the various social formations in their development are determined not only by their specific economic laws, but also by those economic laws which are common to all formations, for example, by the law of the obligatory correspondence of the relations of production to the character of the productive forces. Consequently, social formations are not only separated from each other by specific economic laws inherent in a given mode of production, but are also connected with each other by certain economic laws common to all formations. The laws of economic development are objective laws. They reflect processes of economic development that take place independently of the will of the people. Economic laws arise and operate on the basis of certain economic conditions. People can learn these laws and use them in the public interest, but they cannot destroy or create economic laws. The use of economic laws in class society always has a class background. The advanced class of each new epoch uses economic laws in the interests of the development of society, while the moribund classes resist this. Political economy studies the following historically known basic types of production relations: the primitive communal system, the slaveholding system, feudalism, capitalism, and 5F. Engels, Anti-Düring, 1953, page 138. 23. Socialism. The primitive communal system is a pre-class social system. The slave-holding system, feudalism and capitalism are different forms of society based on the enslavement and exploitation of the working masses. Socialism is a social system free from the exploitation of man by man. Political economy investigates how development takes place from the lower stages of social production to its higher stages, how social orders based on the exploitation of man by man arise, develop, and are destroyed. It shows how the whole course of historical development prepares the way for the victory of the socialist mode of production. It further studies the economic laws of socialism, the laws of the origin of socialist society and its further development on the way to the higher phase of communism. Thus, political economy is the science of the development of socio-productive, i.e., economic, relations between people. It elucidates the laws that govern the production and distribution of material goods in human society at different stages of its development. The method of Marxist political economy is that of dialectical materialism. Marxist-Leninist political economy is based on the application of the basic principles of dialectical and historical materialism to the study of the economic structure of society. Political economy, unlike the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, etc., cannot make use of experiments in the study of the economic structure of society, experiments carried out in artificially created laboratory conditions that eliminate those phenomena that make it difficult to consider the process in its purest form. In the analysis of economic forms, Marx pointed out, neither a microscope nor chemical reagents can be used. Both must be replaced by the power of abstraction. 66K. Marx, Capital, Volume I, 1953, page 4. 24. Each economic system presents a contradictory and complex picture. It contains the remnants of the past and the germs of the future, and various economic forms are intertwined in it. The task of scientific research is to reveal behind the external appearance of economic phenomena by means of theoretical analysis the deep processes, the main features of the economy, which express the essence of the given relations of production. The result of such scientific analysis is economic categories, i.e., concepts that represent the theoretical expression of the relations of production of a given social formation, such as commodity, money, capital, and others. Thus, in his analysis of capitalist relations of production, Marx singled out first of all the simplest, most often repeated mass relation, the exchange of one commodity for another. He shows that in the commodity, this cell of capitalist economy, the contradictions of capitalism are laid in embryo. Proceeding from the analysis of the commodity, Marx explains the origin of money and reveals the process of the transformation of money into capital, the essence of capitalist exploitation. Marx shows how social development inevitably leads to the death of capitalism, to the victory of communism. Marx's method consists in a gradual ascent from the simplest economic categories to the more complex ones, which corresponds to the progressive development of society along an ascending line, from the lowest to the highest. In this order of investigation of the categories of political economy, logical investigation is combined with a historical analysis of social development. Political economy does not set itself the task of studying the historical process of the development of society in all its concrete diversity. It gives basic concepts of the fundamental features of each system of social economy. Lenin pointed out that political economy must be expounded in the form of a description of successive periods of economic development. Accordingly, in the present course of political economy, the main categories of political economy, commodity, money, capital, etc., are considered in the historical sequence in which they arose at different stages of the development of human society. Thus, the elementary concepts of commodities and money are already given in the characterization of pre-capitalist formations. In a detailed form, however, these categories are expounded in the study of developed capitalist economy. As can be seen, political economy does not study any transcendental questions, detached from life, but the most real and urgent questions that affect the vital interests of people, society, and classes. Whether the death of capitalism and the victory of the socialist economic system are inevitable, whether the interests of capitalism are contrary to the interests of society and the progressive development of mankind, whether the working class is the gravedigger of capitalism and the bearer of the ideas of the emancipation of society from capitalism. All these and similar questions are solved by different economists in different ways, depending on the interests of which classes they reflect. This explains precisely why at the present time there is no single political economy for all classes of society, but there are several political economies. Bourgeois political economy, proletarian political economy, and, lastly, the political economy of the intermediate classes, petty bourgeois political economy. But it follows from this that those economists are quite wrong who assert that political economy is a neutral, nonpartisan science, that political economy is independent of the class struggle in society and is not directly or indirectly connected with any political party. Is an objective, impartial political economy that is not afraid of the truth possible at all? Of course, it is possible. Such an objective political economy can only be the political economy of a class which is not interested in glossing over the contradictions and ulcers of capitalism, which is not interested in preserving the capitalist order, whose interests merge with the interests of the liberation of society from capitalist slavery, whose interests lie on a par with the interests of the progressive development of mankind. Such a class is the working class. Therefore, an objective and disinterested political economy can only be a political economy which rests on the interests of the working class. Such is the political economy of Marxism-Leninism. Marxist political economy is an essential component of Marxist-Leninist theory, the great leaders and theoreticians of the working class. K. Marx and F. Engels were the founders of proletarian political economy. In his brilliant work Capital, Marx revealed the laws of the origin, development, and death of capitalism and gave an economic justification for the inevitability of the socialist revolution and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx and Engels elaborated in general terms the doctrine of the transition period from capitalism to socialism and of the two phases of communist society. The economic doctrine of Marxism received further creative development in the works of V.I. Lenin, the founder of the Communist Party and the Soviet state and the brilliant successor of the work of Marx and Engels. Lenin enriched Marxist economics by generalizing the new experience of historical development, created the Marxist doctrine of imperialism, revealed the economic and political essence of imperialism, gave the basic principles of the basic economic law of modern capitalism, worked out the foundations of the doctrine of the general crisis of capitalism, created a new and complete theory of socialist revolution, and scientifically elaborated the basic problems of building socialism and communism. Lenin's great comrade in arms and disciple, J.V. Stalin, advanced and developed a number of new propositions of political economy, basing himself on the fundamental works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, who created a truly scientific political economy. Marxist-Leninist economic theory is creatively developed in the decisions of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and in the works of Lenin's disciples and associates, the leaders of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Communist and Workers' Parties of other countries. Marxist-Leninist political economy is a powerful ideological weapon in the hands of the working class and all working humanity in their struggle for emancipation from capitalist oppression. The vital force of the economic theory of Marxism-Leninism lies in the fact that it equips the working class, the working masses, with knowledge of the laws of economic development of society, gives them clarity of perspective and confidence in the final victory of communism. Chapter I. The PRIMITIVECOMMUNAL mode of production. The emergence of human society. The origin of man dates back to the beginning of the present, quaternary period in the history of the Earth, which, according to science, is a little less than 1,000,000 years old. In various regions of Europe, Asia, and Africa, which were characterized by warm and humid climates, there lived a highly developed breed of anthropoid apes. As a result of a very long development, embracing a series of transitional stages, man has evolved from these remote ancestors. The advent of man was one of the greatest turning points in the development of nature. This change took place when man's ancestors began to make tools. The fundamental difference between man and animal begins only with the manufacture of tools, even the simplest ones. Some animals, such as monkeys, often use a stick or a stone to knock fruit off a tree, to protect themselves from attack. But no animal has ever made even the crudest tool. The conditions of everyday life pushed man's ancestors to make tools. Experience told them that the pointed stones could be used to defend against attack or to hunt animals. Man's ancestors began to make stone tools by striking one stone against another. This was the beginning of the manufacture of guns. Work begins with the making of tools. Thanks to labor, the forelimbs of the anthropoid ape turned into the hands of a man. This is evidenced by the remains of an ape man found by archaeologists, a transitional stage from ape to man. The ape man's brain was much smaller than that of a man, and his hand was comparatively little different from that of a man. Thus, the hand is not only an organ of labor, but also its product. As the hands were freed for labor operations, the ancestors of man increasingly adopted an upright gait. When the hands were busy with work, the final transition to an upright gait took place, which played a very important role in the formation of man. Man's ancestors lived in hordes, herds. The first people also lived in herds. But there arose between people a bond that did not exist and could not exist in the animal world. The bond of labor. People worked together to make tools and used them together. Consequently, the origin of man was at the same time the emergence of human society, the transition from a zoological state to a social one. The joint work of people led to the emergence and development of articulate speech. Language is the means, the instrument, by which people communicate with each other, exchange opinions, and achieve mutual understanding. The exchange of thoughts is a constant and vital necessity, since without it the joint actions of people in the struggle against the forces of nature are impossible. The very existence of social production is impossible. Work and articulate speech had a decisive influence on the improvement of the human organism and on the development of the brain. The development of language is closely related to the development of thinking. In the process of work, a person's range of perceptions and ideas expanded, and his sense organs improved. Man's labor actions, in contrast to the instinctive actions of animals, began to have a conscious character. Thus labor is the first fundamental condition of all human life, and to such an extent that we must in a certain sense say that labor created man himself. 7. Thanks to work, human society arose and began to develop. 7. F. Engels, the role of labor in the process of transforming a monkey into a human. K. Marx, F. Engels, Selected Works, Volume 2, 1948, page 70. Conditions of Material Life. Development of tools. In the primitive epoch, man was in the strongest dependence on the surrounding nature. He was completely overwhelmed by the difficulty of existence, the difficulty of the struggle with nature. The process of mastering the elemental forces of nature proceeded extremely slowly, since the tools of labor were the most primitive. Man's first tools were a rough-hewn stone and a stick. They were, as it were, an artificial extension of the organs of his body. A stone, a fist, a stick, an outstretched arm. People lived in groups that did not exceed a few dozen people. A larger number could not feed together. When the groups met, there were sometimes clashes between them. Many groups died of starvation and fell prey to predatory animals. Under these conditions, living together was the only possible and absolutely necessary thing for people. For a long time, primitive man lived mainly by gathering food and by hunting, which were carried out collectively, with the help of the simplest tools. What was jointly extracted was also consumed jointly. As a result of the lack of food, cannibalism occurred among primitive people. Over the course of many millennia, as if by feeling, by means of an extremely slow accumulation of experience, people learned to make the simplest tools suitable for striking, cutting, digging, and other very simple actions, which at that time almost exhausted the entire field of production. The great conquest of primitive man in the struggle with nature was the discovery of fire. At first, people learned to use fire, which arose spontaneously. They've seen lightning set fire to a tree, they've seen forest fires and volcanic eruptions. Accidentally obtained fire was stored for a long time and carefully. Only many millennia later, man learned the secret of making fire. With the more developed production of tools, people noticed that fire is produced by friction and learned how to make it. The discovery of fire and its use gave men dominion over certain forces of nature. Primitive man finally broke away from the animal world, and the long epoch of man's formation came to an end. Thanks to the discovery of fire, the conditions of material life of people have changed significantly. Firstly, fire was used for cooking, as a result of which the range of food items available to man expanded. It became possible to eat fish, meat, starchy roots, tubers, etc., cooked with the help of fire. Thirdly, fire provided protection from predatory animals. For a long time, hunting remained the most important source of livelihood. It provided people with skins for clothing, bones for making tools, and meat food, which had an impact on the further development of the human body and, above all, on the development of the brain. As man developed physically and mentally, he was able to make better tools. A stick with a pointed end was used for hunting. Then a stone tip was attached to the stick. Axes, stone-tipped spears, stone scrapers and knives appeared. These implements made possible the hunting of large animals and the development of fishing. For a very long time, stone remained the main material for making tools. The era of the predominance of stone tools, dating back hundreds of millennia, is called the Stone Age. Only later did man learn to make tools from metal, first from native metal, primarily from copper. However, copper, as a soft metal, was not widely used for making tools, then from bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, and finally from iron. Accordingly, the Stone Age was followed by the Bronze Age, followed by the Iron Age. The earliest traces of copper smelting in Western Asia date back to the 5th-4th millennia BC. In southern and Central Europe, copper smelting originated approximately in the 3rd-2nd millennia BC. The oldest traces of bronze in Mesopotamia date back to the 4th millennium BC. The earliest traces of iron smelting are found in Egypt. They date back to the period of 1,500 years BC. In Western Europe, the Iron Age began around 1,000 years BC. An important milestone on the way to improving tools was the invention of the bow and arrows, with the advent of which hunting began to provide more necessary means of subsistence. The development of hunting led to the birth of primitive cattle breeding. Hunters began to tame animals. The dog was domesticated before other animals, and later cattle, goats, and pigs. A further major step in the development of society's productive forces was the emergence of primitive agriculture. Gathering the fruits and roots of plants, primitive people began to notice how seeds sprouted when dropped on the ground. Thousands of times this remained incomprehensible, but sooner or later a connection between these phenomena was established in the mind of primitive man, and he began to pass on to the cultivation of plants. This is how agriculture came into being. For a long time, agriculture remained extremely primitive. The earth was loosened by hand, first with a simple stick, then with a stick with a curved end, a hoe. In river valleys, seeds were thrown into the silt brought by river floods. The domestication of animals opened up the possibility of using cattle as draft power. Later, when people mastered the smelting of metal and metal tools appeared, their use made agricultural labor more productive. Agriculture was given a firmer foundation. Primitive tribes began to adopt a settled way of life. Production relations of primitive society. Natural division of labor. The relations of production are determined by the nature and state of the productive forces. In the primitive communal system, the basis of production relations is the communal ownership of the means of production. Communal ownership corresponds to the character of the productive forces in this period. Tools of labor in primitive society were so primitive that they excluded the possibility of primitive people fighting with the forces of nature and predatory animals alone. This primitive type of collective or cooperative production, Marx wrote, was, of course, the result of the weakness of the individual, and not of the socialization of the means of production. 8. Hence the necessity of collective labor, common ownership of land and other means of production, as well as of the products of labor. Primitive people had no concept of private ownership of the means of production. Only a few instruments of production were in their personal possession, which at the same time served as instruments of protection against predatory animals. The labor of primitive man did not create any surplus in excess of the most necessary for life, that is, no surplus product. Under such conditions, there could be no classes in primitive society and no exploitation of man by man. Public ownership extended only to small communities that existed more or less in isolation from each other. According to Lenin's characterization, here the social character of production embraced only the members of one commune. The labor activity of people of primitive society was based on simple cooperation, Simple Co. 8 rough drafts of Marx's letter, V. I. Zasulik, K. Marx and F. Engels, Works, Volume 27, page 681. Operation is the simultaneous employment of a more or less considerable quantity of labor power for the performance of homogeneous work. Simple cooperation already opened up for primitive people the possibility of performing tasks that would have been unthinkable for a single person to perform. For example, when hunting large animals. At that time, the extremely low level of development of the productive forces was inevitable and the equalizing distribution of the products of common labor was inevitable. The meager food was divided equally. There could be no other division, since the products of labor were barely enough to satisfy the most urgent needs. If one member of the primitive community received more than an equal share for all, then someone else would be doomed to starvation and death. The habit of equal sharing was deeply rooted among primitive peoples. It was observed by travelers who visited tribes at a low stage of social development. The great naturalist Darwin circumnavigated the globe more than 100 years ago. Describing the life of the tribes in Tierra del Fuego, he tells the following story. The Fuegians were presented with a piece of linen. They tore the canvas into perfectly equal parts so that everyone would get an equal share. Proceeding from the foregoing, it would be possible to formulate the basic economic law of the primitive communal system in the following way. The provision of extremely poor living conditions for people with the help of primitive instruments of production by means of joint labor within the framework of one community and equalizing distribution of products. With the development of the instruments of production, the division of labor emerged. Its simplest form was the natural division of labor, that is, the division of labor according to sex and age, between men and women, between adults, children, and the elderly. The famous Russian traveler Mikluho Maklay, who studied the life of the Papuans of New Guinea in the second half of the 19th century, describes the collective process of labor in agriculture in the following way. Several men stand in a row, stick their sharpened sticks deep into the ground, and then lift a block of earth with one swing. They are followed by women crawling on their knees. They have sticks in their hands, with which they crush the earth raised by the men. The women are followed by children of different ages, rubbing the ground with their hands. After loosening the soil, the women use small sticks to make holes in the ground and bury the seeds or roots of plants in them. Work here is cooperative, and at the same time there is a division of labor according to sex and age. With the development of the productive forces, the natural division of labor was gradually strengthened and consolidated. The specialization of men in the field of hunting, women in the field of gathering plant food and in the household led to a certain increase in labor productivity. Tribal system. Matriarchal gens. Patriarchal gens. While the process of separating man from the animal world was going on, people lived in hordes, herds, like their immediate ancestors. But later, in connection with the emergence of the primitive economy and the growth of the population, the clan organization of society was formed. In those days, only people who were related to each other could unite for joint work. Primitive instruments of production limited the possibilities of collective labor to the narrow confines of a group of people bound together by kinship and common life. Primitive man was generally hostile to anyone who was not related to him by kinship and common life. The clan was a group that at first consisted of only a few dozen people and was welded together by ties of blood kinship. Each such group existed separately from other similar groups. In the course of time, the number of the clan increased, reaching several hundred people. The habit of living together developed. The benefits of common labor increasingly compelled people to stick together. Morgan, a researcher of the life of primitive people, described the clan system that was preserved among the Iroquois Indians in the middle of the last century. The main occupations of the Iroquois were hunting, fishing, gathering fruits and agriculture. Labor was divided between men and women. Hunting and fishing, making weapons and tools, clearing the ground, building huts and fortifications were the duties of men. Women performed the main work in the fields, harvested crops and delivered them to the storerooms, cooked food, made clothes and pottery, collected wild fruits, berries, nuts, tubers. The land was the common property of the clan. Larger-scale works, deforestation, clearing of land for arable land, large hunting expeditions, were carried out jointly. The Iroquois lived in so-called big houses that housed 20 or more families. Such a group had common storerooms where food supplies were stored. The woman at the head of the group distributed the food among the individual families. For the duration of hostilities, the clan chose a military commander who did not enjoy any material advantages. With the end of hostilities, his power ceased. At the first stage of the clan system, the leading position was occupied by women, which resulted from the conditions of people's material life at that time. Hunting with the most primitive tools, which was the business of men, could not fully sustain the existence of men. Its results were more or less accidental. Under these conditions, even rudimentary forms of agriculture and cattle breeding, the domestication of animals, were of great economic significance. These occupations served as a more reliable and constant source of livelihood than hunting. And agriculture and cattle breeding, so long as they were carried on in a primitive manner, were chiefly the occupation of the women, who remained at home, while the men hunted. For a long period of time, women played a dominant role in the tribal community. Kinship was considered to be on the maternal side. The boundaries of the clan community were narrow. It included the descendants of one woman. It was the matriarchal clan, matriarchy. In the course of the further development of the productive forces, when nomadic cattle breeding, pastoralism, and more developed agriculture, tillage, which were the work of men, began to play a decisive role in the life of the primitive community, the matriarchal clan was replaced by the paternal, or patriarchal, clan, patriarchate. The dominant position passed to the man. He became the head of the tribal community. Kinship began to be counted on the paternal line. The boundaries of the community have significantly expanded in comparison with the maternal kind. The patriarchal clan existed in the last period of the primitive communal system. The absence of private property, the class division of society, and the exploitation of man by man precluded the possibility of the existence of the state. In primitive society, there are no signs of the existence of the state yet. We see the supremacy of custom, the authority, the respect, the authority exercised by the elders of the gens. We see that this power was sometimes recognized by women. The position of women at that time did not resemble the present powerless and oppressed position, but nowhere do we see a special class of people who set themselves apart to govern others and to possess in the interests of systematically, for the purpose of government, a certain apparatus of coercion, the apparatus of violence. 9. The emergence of the social division of labor and exchange. With the transition to cattle breeding and agriculture, the social division of labor arose, i.e., the division of labor in which first different communities, and then individual members of communities, began to engage in heterogeneous types of productive activity. The separation of pastoral tribes was the first major social division of labor. Pastoral tribes achieved considerable success in cattle breeding. They learned how to take care of cattle in such a way that they began to get more meat, wool, and milk. This first large-scale social division of labor led to a noticeable increase in labor productivity at that time. In the primitive community, for a long time, there was no ground for exchange between its individual members. The entire product was obtained and consumed jointly. Exchange originated and developed at first between tribal communities and for a long time was of an occasional nature. With the appearance of the first major social division of labor, the situation changed. Pastoral tribes had a certain surplus of livestock, dairy products, meat, hides, and wool. At the same time, they were in need of agricultural products. In turn, the tribes engaged in agriculture achieved certain successes in the production of agricultural products in the course of time. Farmers and herders needed items that they 9 volts. I. Lenin, on the State, Essays, Volume 29, page 437. Could not get at their place of residence. All this led to the development of exchange. Along with agriculture and cattle breeding, other types of production activities were also developed. Back in the era of stone tools, people learned to make pottery from clay. Then came hand weaving. Finally, with the discovery of iron smelting, it became possible to manufacture metal tools, a plow with an iron plowshare, an iron axe, and weapons, iron swords. It became more and more difficult to combine these types of labor with agricultural or pastoral labor. In the communities, people who were engaged in crafts gradually stood out. The products of artisans, blacksmiths, gunsmiths, potters, etc. increasingly began to come into exchange. The field of exchange has expanded significantly. The emergence of private property and classes, disintegration of the primitive communal system, The primitive communal system reached its zenith under matriarchy. The patriarchal clan already harbored the rudiments of the disintegration of the primitive communal system. Up to a certain period, the production relations of the primitive communal system were in accordance with the level of development of the productive forces. At the last stage of patriarchy, with the appearance of new, more perfect instruments of production, the Iron Age, the relations of production of primitive society ceased to correspond to the new productive forces. The narrow framework of communal ownership and the egalitarian distribution of the products of labor began to hinder the development of new productive forces. Previously, it was possible to cultivate the field only by the joint work of dozens of people. Under such conditions, common labor was a necessity. With the development of the instruments of production and the increase in the productivity of labor, one family was able to cultivate a piece of land and provide itself with the necessary means of subsistence. Thus, the improvement of the instruments of production created the possibility of a transition to individual farming, as it was more productive in those historical conditions. The need for joint labor and communal farming increasingly disappeared. If common labor required common ownership of the means of production, individual labor required private ownership. The emergence of private property is inseparably linked with the social division of labor and with the development of exchange. At first, the exchange was carried out by the heads of tribal communities, elders and patriarchs. They acted in barter transactions as representatives of the communities. What they exchanged was the property of the community. But with the further development of the social division of labor and the expansion of exchange, the tribal chiefs gradually began to treat the communal property as their property. In the beginning, cattle were the main object of exchange. Pastoral communities had large herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. The elders and patriarchs, already wielding great power in society, were accustomed to disposing of these flocks as if they were their own. Their de facto right to dispose of the herds was also recognized by the rest of the community. In this way, cattle became private property first, and then gradually all instruments of production. Common ownership of land lasted the longest. The advent of private property led to the disintegration of the gens. The clan broke up into large patriarchal families. Then, within the large patriarchal family, separate family units began to emerge, which turned the instruments of production, utensils, and livestock into their private property. With the growth of private property, clan ties weakened. The place of the clan community began to be taken by the rural community. The village or neighbor community, in contrast to the clan, consisted of people who were not necessarily related by kinship. The house, the household, the cattle were all privately owned by individual families. On the contrary, the forest, the meadow, the water, and other lands, and for a certain period of time the arable land, were communal property. Initially, the arable land was periodically redistributed among community members, and later it became private property. The emergence of private property in exchange was the beginning of a profound revolution in the entire structure of primitive society. The development of private property and property differences led to the fact that different groups of community members had different interests within the communities. Under these conditions, those who held the positions of elders, military leaders, and priests in the community used their position for the purpose of enrichment. They took possession of a large share of communal property. The holders of these public positions were more and more separated from the mass of community members, forming the clan nobility and more often passing on their power by inheritance. At the same time, the noble families became the richest families. The mass of community members gradually fell into one or another economic dependence on the rich and noble elite. With the growth of productive forces, human labor used in cattle breeding and agriculture began to provide more means of subsistence than was necessary to sustain human life. It became possible to appropriate surplus labor and surplus product, i.e. surplus labor and product in excess of what is required to feed the worker himself. Under these conditions, it turned out to be advantageous not to kill the captured people, as had been done before, but to force them to work, turning them into slaves. Slaves were captured by more noble and wealthy families. In turn, slave labor led to a further increase in inequality, as households that used slaves quickly became rich. In the face of growing wealth inequality, the rich began to enslave not only captives, but also their impoverished and indebted fellow tribesmen. This is how the first-class division of society arose, the division into slaveholders and slaves. The exploitation of man by man appeared, that is, the gratuitous appropriation by some people of the products of the labor of other people. The production relations of the primitive communal system disintegrated, perished and gave way to new production relations that corresponded to the nature of the new productive forces. Common labor gave way to individual labor, social ownership to private property, and the clan system to class society. From this period onwards, the entire history of mankind up to the construction of socialist society has become the history of the class struggle. Bourgeois ideologues portray the matter as if private property had existed from eternity. History refutes these fabrications and convincingly testifies to the fact that all peoples passed through the stage of the primitive communal system, based on common property and without private property. Social conceptions of the primitive epoch. Primitive man, oppressed by want and the difficulty of the struggle for existence, did not at first distinguish himself from the surrounding nature. For a long time he had no coherent conception of himself or of the natural conditions of his existence. Only gradually does primitive man begin to develop very limited and primitive ideas about himself and his surroundings. There could be no question of any religious views that were inherent in the human mind, as the defenders of religion assert. Only later did primitive man begin to populate the world around him with supernatural beings, spirits, and magical powers. He spiritualized the forces of nature. This was the so-called animism, from the Latin word anima, soul. Out of these dark conceptions of man's own and external natures were born primitive myths and primitive religion. They reproduced the primitive egalitarianism of the social system. Ignorant of class divisions and inequality of property in real life, primitive man did not introduce any subordination into the imaginary world of spirits. He divided spirits into friends and foes, friendly and hostile. The division of spirits into higher and lower appeared already in the period of the disintegration of the primitive communal system. Primitive man felt himself to be an inseparable part of the tribal community. He did not think of himself outside the clan. This was reflected in ideology by the cult of ancestors. Characteristically, in the course of language development, the words I and my appear much later than other words. The power of the tribal community over the individual was extremely strong. The disintegration of the primitive communal system was accompanied by the emergence and spread of private property ideas. This was vividly reflected in myths and religious beliefs. When private property relations began to take shape and property inequality appeared, many tribes developed the custom of imposing a religious prohibition, taboo, on property appropriated by chiefs or wealthy families. The word taboo was used by the inhabitants of the Pacific Islands to designate everything forbidden, withdrawn from common use. With the disintegration of the primitive communal system and the emergence of private property, the power of religious prohibition began to be used to consolidate the economic relations that had arisen in property inequality. Brief conclusions. 1. Through work, human beings emerged from the animal kingdom and human society emerged. A distinctive feature of human labor is the manufacture of instruments of production. 2. The productive forces of primitive society were at an extremely low level. The instruments of production were extremely primitive. This necessitated collective labor, social ownership of the means of production, and egalitarian distribution. Under the primitive communal system, there was no property inequality, no private ownership of the means of production, no classes and no exploitation. Social ownership of the means of production was confined to a narrow framework. It was the property of small communities, more or less isolated from each other. 3. The essential features of the basic economic law of the primitive communal system are provision of extremely poor living conditions for people with the help of primitive instruments of production by means of joint labor within the framework of one community and equalizing distribution of products. 4. Working together, people have long performed homogeneous labor. The gradual improvement of the instruments of production contributed to the emergence of a natural division of labor depending on sex and age. Further improvement of the instruments of production and the method of obtaining means of subsistence, the development of cattle breeding and agriculture led to the emergence of the social division of labor and exchange, private property and property inequality, to the division of society into classes and to exploitation man by man. Thus, the increased productive forces came into conflict with the production relations, as a result of which the primitive communal system gave way to another type of production relations, the slave-holding system. Chapter 2. The slave-holding mode of production. Emergence of the slave-holding system. Slavery is the first and crudest form of exploitation in history. It existed in the past among almost all peoples. For the first time in the history of mankind, the transition from the primitive communal system to the slave-holding system took place in the countries of the ancient East. The slave-holding mode of production prevailed in Mesopotamia, the Sumerian state, Babylonia, Assyria, and others, in Egypt, India, and China as early as the 4th-2nd millennia BC. In the 1st millennium BC, the slave-holding mode of production prevailed in Transcaucasia, the state of Urartu, from the 8th-7th centuries BC to the VV centuries AD, there was a strong slave-holding state in Khorasan. The culture achieved in the slave-holding countries of the ancient East had a great influence on the development of the peoples of European countries. In Greece, the slave-holding mode of production reached its heyday in the 5th-4th centuries BC. Subsequently, slavery developed in the states of Asia Minor, Egypt, and Macedonia, 4th-1st centuries BC. The slave-holding system reached its highest stage of development in Rome in the period from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD. At first, slavery had a patriarchal, domestic character. Slaves were comparatively few. Slave labor was not yet the basis of production, but played an auxiliary role in the economy. The purpose of the economy was to satisfy the needs of the large patriarchal family, which almost did not resort to exchange. The master's power over his slaves was already unlimited, but the field of slave labor remained limited. The transition of society to the slave-holding system was based on the further growth of productive forces, the development of the social division of labor and exchange. The transition from stone to metal tools led to a significant expansion of the scope of human labor. The invention of blacksmith's bellows made it possible to make iron tools of unprecedented strength. With the help of an iron axe, it became possible to clear the land from forests and shrubs for arable land. A plow with an iron plowshare made it possible to cultivate relatively large plots of land. Primitive hunting economy gave way to agriculture and cattle breeding. Crafts appeared. In agriculture, which remained the main branch of production, the methods of agriculture and cattle breeding improved. New branches of agriculture arose: viticulture, flax growing, the cultivation of oilseeds, and so on. More and more workers were needed to take care of the livestock. Weaving, metalworking, pottery and other crafts were gradually improved. Previously, the craft was an auxiliary occupation of the farmer and cattle breeder. Now it has become an independent occupation for many people. There was a separation of handicrafts from agriculture. This was the second great social division of labor. With the division of production into two major main branches, agriculture and handicrafts, production for exchange arises, though still in an undeveloped form. The growth of labor productivity led to an increase in the mass of surplus product, which, with private ownership of the means of production, created the possibility of accumulating wealth in the hands of a minority of society and, on this basis, subordinating the working majority to the exploiting minority, turning the working people into slaves. The economy under slavery was basically subsistence, in which the products of labor were consumed within the framework of the same economy in which they were produced. But at the same time, there was a development of exchange. Artisans produced their wares first to order and then to sell in the market. At the same time, many of them continued to have small plots of land for a long time and cultivate them to meet their needs. Peasants were mainly subsistence farmers, but had to sell some of their produce on the market in order to be able to buy handicrafts and pay cash taxes. Thus, gradually, a part of the products of the labor of artisans and peasants became a commodity. A commodity is a product made not for direct consumption, but for exchange, for sale on the market. The production of products for exchange is a characteristic feature of commodity economy. Thus, the separation of handicraft from agriculture, the emergence of handicraft as an independent craft signified the origin of commodity production. As long as the exchange was accidental, one product of labor was directly exchanged for another. As exchange expanded and became a regular phenomenon, a commodity was gradually distinguished for which any other commodity was willingly given. That's how money came into being. Money is the universal commodity by which all other commodities are valued, and which serves as an intermediary in exchange. The development of handicrafts and exchange led to the formation of cities. Cities arose in ancient times, at the dawn of the slave-holding mode of production. In the beginning, cities were not much different from villages. But gradually, crafts and trade were concentrated in the cities. By the occupation of the inhabitants and by their way of life, the cities were more and more separated from the countryside. This was the beginning of the separation of the city from the countryside and the emergence of an opposition between them. As the mass of commodities exchanged increased, so did the territorial scope of exchange. There were merchants who, in pursuit of profit, bought goods from producers, brought goods to markets, sometimes quite far from the place of production, and sold them to consumers. The expansion of production and exchange greatly increased wealth inequality. In the hands of the rich, money, draft animals, tools of production, and seeds were accumulated. The poor were increasingly forced to turn to them for loans, mostly in kind, and sometimes in cash. The rich lent instruments of production, seeds, and money, enslaving their debtors, and in case of non-payment of debts, they enslaved them and took away their land. This is how usury came into being. It brought a further increase in wealth to some, debt bondage to others. Land also began to turn into private property. They began to sell it and mortgage it. If the debtor could not pay the moneylender, he had to abandon the land, sell his children and himself into slavery. Sometimes, finding fault with something, large landowners seized part of the meadows and pastures from peasant rural communities. This was the concentration of landed property, monetary wealth, and the mass of slaves in the hands of rich slaveholders. Small peasant farming became more and more ruined, and slaveholding economy grew stronger and expanded, spreading to all branches of production. The incessant growth of production, and with it the productivity of labor, has increased the value of human labor. Slavery, which had just arisen and was sporadic in the previous stage of development, now becomes an essential component of the social system. Slaves cease to be mere helpers. Dozens of them are now being driven to work in the fields and workshops. Slave labor became the basis of society's existence. Society split into two main opposing classes, slaves and slaveholders. This is how the slave-holding mode of production was formed. 10F. Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, K. Marx, F. Engels, Selected Works, Volume 2, 1948, page 296. Under the slave-holding system, the population was divided into free and slaves. The free enjoyed all civil, property, and political rights, with the exception of women, who were in fact in a position of slavery. Slaves were deprived of all these rights and had no access to the free. The free, in turn, were divided into the class of large landowners, who were at the same time large slaveholders, and the class of small producers, peasants, artisans, whose well-to-do strata also used slave labor and were slaveholders. The priests, who played an important role in the era of slavery, were attached to the class of large landowners, slaveholders. Along with the class contradiction between slaves and slaveholders, there was also a class contradiction between the big landowners and the peasants. But, since with the development of the slave-holding system, slave labor, as the cheapest labor, embraced most of the branches of production and became the main basis of production, the contradiction between slaves and slaveholders turned into the main contradiction of society. The division of society into classes necessitated the state. With the growth of the social division of labor and the development of exchange, individual clans and tribes became more and more close, uniting in unions. The nature of tribal institutions was changing. The organs of the Gentile system were increasingly losing their national character. They were transformed into organs of domination over the people, into organs of plunder and oppression of their own and neighboring tribes. The elders and military commanders of clans and tribes became princes and kings. Previously, they enjoyed authority as elected representatives of the clan or the union of clans. Now they began to use their power to protect the interests of the propertied elite, to restrain their ruined relatives, to suppress slaves. This purpose was served by armed squads, courts, and punitive bodies. This is how state power was born. Only when the first form of division of society into classes appeared, when slavery appeared, when it was possible for a certain class of people, concentrating on the crudest forms of agricultural labor, to produce a certain surplus, when this surplus was not absolutely necessary for the most miserable existence of the slave and fell into the hands of the slaveholder, when, therefore, the existence of this class of slaveholders was established, and so that it was consolidated, it was necessary for the state to appear. 11. The state came into being in order to keep the exploited majority in check in the interests of the exploiting minority. The slaveholding state played an important role in the development and consolidation of production relations of slaveholding society. The slaveholding state kept the masses of slaves in obedience. It has grown into a wide-ranging apparatus of domination and violence over the masses of the people. Democracy in ancient Greece and Rome, which is extolled in bourgeois history textbooks, was essentially a slaveholding democracy. Production relations of the slaveholding system. The status of slaves. The production relations of slaveholding society were based on the fact that slaveholders owned not only the means of production, but also the workers of production, slaves. A slave was considered a thing, he was at the complete and undivided disposal of the owner. Slaves were not only exploited, they were sold, bought like cattle, and even killed with impunity. If in the period of patriarchal slavery a slave was considered as a member of the family, 11 volts. I. Lenin, On the State, Essays, Volume 29, page 441. Then under the conditions of the slaveholding mode of production he was not even considered a person. The slave did not sell his labor power to the slaveholder, just as the ox does not sell his labor to the peasant. The slave, together with his labor power, is sold once and for all to his master. 12. Slave labor was openly coercive. Slaves were forced to work by the most brutal physical violence. They were whipped to work and severely punished for the slightest omission. Slaves were branded so that they could be more easily caught while escaping. Many of them wore non-removable iron collars, on which the owner's surname was indicated. The slaveholder appropriated the entire product of slave labor. He gave the slaves only the smallest amount of means of subsistence, so that they would not die of hunger and could continue to work for the slaveholder. The slaveholder received not only the surplus product, but also a significant part of the necessary product of the slave's labor. The development of the slaveholding mode of production was accompanied by an increase in the demand for slaves. In a number of countries, slaves generally did not have a family. The predatory exploitation of slaves led to their rapid physical deterioration. It was necessary to replenish the number of slaves all the time. War was an important source of obtaining new slaves. The slaveholding states of the ancient East waged constant wars in order to subjugate other peoples. The history of ancient Greece is full of wars between individual city-states, between metropolises and colonies, between Greek and Eastern states. Rome waged incessant wars. In its heyday, it conquered most of the lands known at that time. Not only warriors who were 12K. Marx, Wage Labor and Capital, K. Marx, F. Engels, Selected Works, Volume I, 1948, page 57. Taken prisoner were enslaved, but also a significant part of the population of the conquered lands. Another source of slaves was the provinces and colonies. They supplied slaveholders with living goods along with all sorts of other goods. The slave trade was one of the most profitable and prosperous branches of economic activity. Special centers of the slave trade were formed. Fairs were held, which brought together merchants and buyers from distant countries. The slave-holding mode of production opened up wider opportunities for the growth of productive forces in comparison with the primitive communal system. The concentration of a large number of slaves in the hands of the slaveholding state and individual slaveholders made it possible to use simple cooperation of labor on a large scale. This is evidenced by the preserved gigantic structures that were erected in antiquity by the peoples of Asia, the Egyptians, the Etruscans, irrigation systems, roads, bridges, military fortifications, cultural monuments. The social division of labor developed, expressed in the specialization of agricultural and handicraft production, which created conditions for increasing labor productivity. In Greece, slave labor was widely used in handicraft production. Large workshops, ergasteria, appeared, in which several dozen slaves worked. Slave labor was also used in construction, in the extraction of iron ore, silver and gold. In Rome, slave labor was widespread in agriculture. The Roman nobility owned vast estates, latifundia, where hundreds and thousands of slaves worked. These latifundia were created by seizing peasant as well as free state lands. Slave-holding latifundia, due to the cheapness of slave labor and the use of the advantages of simple cooperation of labor to a certain extent, were able to produce grain and other agricultural products at lower costs than small farms of free peasants. The small peasantry was ousted, enslaved, or joined the ranks of the mendicant strata of the urban population, the lumpen proletariat. On the basis of slave labor, the ancient world achieved significant economic and cultural development. But the slave-holding system could not create conditions for further more or less serious technical progress, since production was carried out on the basis of slave labor, which was characterized by extremely low productivity. The slave was not in the least interested in the results of his work. Slaves hated their enslavement. They often expressed their protest and indignation by damaging the tools. Therefore, slaves were given only the crudest tools, which were difficult to spoil. The technique of production based on slavery remained at a very low level. In spite of the well-known development of the natural and exact sciences, they were almost never used in production. Some technical inventions were used only in military affairs and construction. During a number of centuries of its domination, the slave-holding mode of production did not go beyond the use of hand tools borrowed from the small farmer and artisan, beyond the simple cooperation of labor. The main motive force remained the physical strength of people and livestock. The widespread use of slave labor allowed slaveholders to free themselves from all physical labor and completely shifted to slaves. Slaveholders treated labor with contempt, considered it an occupation unworthy of a free man, and led a parasitic lifestyle. With the development of slavery, more and more masses of the free population became detached from all productive activity. Only a certain part of the slaveholding elite and other free population was engaged in state affairs, sciences and arts. Thus, the slave-holding system gave rise to an opposition between physical and mental labor, a gap between them. Exploitation of slaves by slaveholders is the main feature of production relations of slaveholding society. At the same time, the slaveholding mode of production in different countries had its own peculiarities. In the countries of the ancient East, subsistence farming prevailed to an even greater extent than in the ancient world. Here, slave labor was widely used in state farms, the farms of large feudal lords, and temples. Domestic slavery was highly developed. In the agriculture of China, India, Babylonia, and Egypt, along with slaves, huge masses of peasant community members were exploited. The system of indentured debt slavery has acquired great importance here. A peasant community member, who did not pay his debt to the lender-usurer or the landowner's rent, was forced to work in their farm for a certain time as a slave debtor. In the slave-holding countries of the ancient East, communal and state forms of land ownership were widespread. The existence of these forms of ownership was associated with a system of agriculture based on irrigation. Irrigated agriculture in the river valleys of the East required enormous labor expenditures for the construction of dams, canals, reservoirs, and drainage of swamps. All this necessitated the centralization of the construction and use of irrigation systems on a large scale. Agriculture here is mainly based on artificial irrigation, and this irrigation is already a matter for the commune, the region, or the central government. 13 With the development of slavery,
communal lands were concentrated in the hands of the state. The supreme owner of the land was the king, who had unlimited power.
Concentrating the ownership of land in its hands, the state of slaveholders imposed huge taxes on the peasants, forced them to perform various kinds of duties, thereby making the peasants slave-dependent. The peasants remained members of the community. But when the land was concentrated in the hands of the slaveholding state, the 13F. Engels, Letter to Karl Marx on June 6, 1853, by Karl Marx and F. Engels, Works, Volume 21, page 494. Commune was a solid basis for Oriental despotism, i.e., the unlimited autocratic power of the monarch-despot. The priestly aristocracy played an enormous role in the slaveholding countries of the East. The vast farms belonging to the temples were conducted on the basis of slave labor. Under the slave-holding system in all countries, slaveholders spent the overwhelming part of slave labor and its product unproductively, on satisfying personal whims, accumulating treasures, building military fortifications and army, on building and maintaining luxurious palaces and temples. The unproductive expenditure of huge masses of labor is evidenced, in particular, by the Egyptian pyramids that have survived to the present day. Only a small part of slave labor and its product was expended in the further expansion of production, which consequently developed extremely slowly. Devastating wars led to the destruction of the productive forces, the extermination of vast masses of the civilian population, and the destruction of the culture of entire states. The essential features of the basic economic law of the slave-holding system are approximately as follows. Appropriation by slaveholders of surplus product for their parasitic consumption by means of predatory exploitation of the mass of slaves on the basis of full ownership of the means of production and slaves, by ruin and enslavement of peasants and artisans, as well as by conquest and enslavement of the peoples of other countries. Further development of the exchange, trade and usurious capital. The slaveholding economy was mainly subsistence in slaveholder, his numerous hangers-on and servants. Nevertheless, exchange gradually began to play a more prominent role, especially in the period of the highest development of the slave-holding system. In a number of branches of production, a certain proportion of the products of labor were regularly sold on the market, i.e., converted into commodities. With the expansion of exchange, the role of money increased. Usually, the commodity, which was the most common object of exchange, was singled out as money. In many nations, especially among cattle breeders, cattle were at first used as money. For others, salt, grain, and furs became money. Gradually, all other forms of money were supplanted by metallic money. For the first time, metal money appeared in the countries of the ancient East. Money in the form of bronze, silver and gold ingots circulated here as early as the 3-2 millennia BC, and in the form of coins, from the 7th century BC. In Greece, 8 centuries before our era, iron money was in circulation. In Rome, as early as the 5th and 4th centuries BC, only copper money was used. Subsequently, iron and copper as money were replaced by silver and gold. In silver and gold, all the advantages of metals, by virtue of which they are most suitable for the performance of the role of money, are especially strongly expressed. Homogeneity of matter, divisibility, preservation, and insignificance of volume and weight at a high value. Therefore, the role of money was firmly entrenched in precious metals, and ultimately in gold. The Greek city-states carried on quite extensive trade, including with the Greek colonies scattered along the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. The colonies regularly supplied the main labor force, slaves, certain types of raw materials and means of subsistence, leather, wool, livestock, bread, fish. In Rome, as in Greece, in addition to the trade in slaves and other goods, the trade in luxury goods played an important role. These articles were brought from the East chiefly by means of all kinds of tribute exacted from the conquered peoples. Trade was associated with plunder, sea robbery, and the enslavement of colonies. Under the conditions of the slave-holding system, money was no longer only a means of buying and selling goods. They also began to serve as a means of appropriating the labor of others through trade and usury. The money expended for the purpose of appropriating surplus labor and its product becomes capital, i.e., a means of exploitation. Trade and usurious capital have historically been the first types of capital. Mercantile capital is capital employed in the sphere of exchange of commodities. Merchants, buying and reselling goods, appropriated a significant part of the surplus product created by slaves, small peasants and artisans.
Usurious capital is capital used in the form of loans of money, means of production or consumer goods for the appropriation of surplus labor of peasants and artisans by charging high interest. Usurers also provided money loans to the slave-holding nobility, thus participating in the division of the surplus product received by them. Aggravation of the contradictions of the slave-holding mode of production. Slavery was a necessary stage in the development of mankind. Only slavery made possible on a larger scale the division of labor between agriculture and industry, and thus created the conditions for the flourishing of the culture of the ancient world, for Greek culture. Without slavery there would have been no Greek state, no Greek art and no science. Without slavery, there would have been no Roman state. And without the foundations laid by Greece and Rome, there would be no modern Europe. 14. On the bones of generations of slaves, a culture grew, which formed the basis for the further development of mankind. Many branches of knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, architecture, reached a significant development in the ancient world. Objects of art left over from antiquity, works of fiction, sculpture, architecture have forever entered the treasury of human culture. But the slave-holding system was fraught with insurmountable contradictions that led to its destruction. The slave-holding form of exploitation destroyed the main productive force of this society, slaves. The struggle of the slaves against cruel forms of exploitation was increasingly expressed in armed uprisings. The condition for the existence of the slave-holding economy was a continuous influx of slaves and their cheapness. Slaves were brought mainly by war. The basis of the military power of the slave-holding society was the mass of free small producers, peasants and artisans. They served in the army and bore on their shoulders the brunt of the taxes necessary to wage wars. But as a result of the competition of large-scale production, based on cheap slave labor, and under the burden of unbearable hardships, peasants and artisans were ruined. The irreconcilable contradiction between the large latifundia and the peasant farms deepened. The ousting of the free peasantry undermined not only the economic, but also the military and political power of the slave-holding states, in particular Rome. Victories were replaced by defeats. Wars of conquest were replaced by defensive ones. The source of the incessant supply of cheap slaves had dried up. The negative aspects of slave labor became more and more apparent. In the last 2 centuries of the Roman Empire, there was a general decline in production. Trade was in disarray. The formerly rich lands 14f. Engels, Anti-Düring, 1953, page 169. Became impoverished, the population began to decrease, crafts perished, and cities fell into desolation. Large-scale slave-holding production became economically unprofitable. Slaveholders began to set free large groups of slaves whose labor no longer provided income. Large estates were divided into small plots. These plots were transferred under certain conditions either to former slaves who had been set free, or to previously free citizens, who were now obliged to bear a number of duties in favor of the landowner. New farmers were attached to land plots and could be sold with them. But they were no longer slaves. It was a new stratum of small producers, who occupied an intermediate position between free and slaves, and who had some interest in labor. They were called colons and were the forerunners of medieval serfs. Thus, in the depths of slaveholding society, elements of a new, feudal mode of production were born. The class struggle of the exploited against the exploiters. Slave revolts. The death of the slave-holding system. The relations of production based on slavery became shackles for the growing productive forces of society. The labor of slaves, who were not at all interested in the results of production, had outlived its usefulness. There was a historical need to replace slave-holding production relations with other production relations, which would change the position of the main productive force, the toiling masses, in society. The law of the obligatory correspondence of the relations of production to the character of the productive forces required the replacement of slaves by workers who were to some extent interested in the results of their labor. The history of slaveholding societies in the countries of the ancient East, Greece and Rome shows that with the development of the slaveholding economy, the class struggle of the enslaved masses against their oppressors intensified. Slave revolts were intertwined with the struggle of the exploited small peasants against the slaveholding elite, the large landowners. The contradiction between the small producers and the large noble landowners gave rise to a democratic movement among the free, which aimed at the abolition of debt bondage, the redistribution of land, the abolition of the preemptive rights of the landed aristocracy, and the transfer of power to the demos, i.e., the people. Of the numerous slave revolts in the Roman Empire, the most significant was the revolt led by Spartacus, 74–71 BC. His name is associated with the brightest page in the history of the struggle of slaves against slaveholders. Over the centuries, slave revolts have erupted repeatedly. The slaves were joined by impoverished peasants. These revolts reached a particular strength in the 2nd–1st centuries BC and in the 3rd–5th centuries AD. Slaveholders suppressed rebellions with the most ferocious measures. The revolts of the exploited masses, especially the slaves, fundamentally undermined the former power of Rome. Blows from within began to become more and more intertwined with blows from without. Enslaved inhabitants of neighboring lands rebelled in the fields of Italy, and at the same time their fellow tribesmen, who remained at large, stormed the borders of the empire, invaded its borders, and destroyed Roman rule. These circumstances hastened the collapse of the slave-holding system in Rome. In the Roman Empire, the slave-holding mode of production reached its highest development. The death of the Roman Empire was also the death of the slave-holding system as a whole. The slave-holding system was replaced by the feudal system. Economic views of the slave era. The economic views of the slave-holding period were reflected in many literary monuments left by poets, philosophers, historians, statesmen, and public figures. According to these leaders, the slave was not considered a person, but a thing in the hands of the master. Slave labor was despised, and since labor became predominantly the lot of slaves, it followed from this a contempt for labor in general as an activity unworthy of a free man. The economic views of slaveholding Babylonia are evidenced by the Code of Laws of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, 18th century BC. The code protects the property and personal rights of the rich and noble, slave owners and landowners. According to the code, anyone who harbors a runaway slave is punished by death. A peasant who fails to pay a debt to a lender or rent to a landlord must enslave his wife, son or daughter. The ancient Indian compendium The Laws of Manu set forth the social, religious, and moral precepts that sanctified slavery. According to these laws, a slave has no property. A slave, even when released by his master, is not freed from slave labor, which is supposedly predestined for him by God and nature. The views of the ruling classes found expression in religion. For example, Buddhism became widespread in India from the 6th century BC. Proclaiming reconciliation with reality, non-resistance to violence, and humility before the ruling classes, Buddhism was a religion that benefited the slave-owning nobility and was used by them to strengthen their domination. Even the great minds of antiquity could not have imagined the existence of a society without slavery. 4. Example: the outstanding Greek philosopher Plato, 5th–4th centuries BC, wrote the first book in the history of mankind about the ideal social order. But even in his ideal state, he kept the slaves. The labor of slaves, farmers, and artisans was supposed to provide the means of subsistence for the upper class of rulers and warriors. In the eyes of the greatest thinker of antiquity, Aristotle, 4th century BC, slavery was also an eternal and inevitable necessity for society. Aristotle had a great influence on the development of mental culture in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages. Having risen high above the level of contemporary society in his scientific conjectures and foresights, Aristotle remained captive to the ideas of his age on the question of slavery. His views on slavery were as follows: for the helmsman, the rudder is an inanimate instrument, and the slave is an animate instrument. If the tools worked on their own, if, for example, the shuttles weaved themselves, then there would be no need for slaves. But since there are many occupations in the household that require simple, rough labor, nature wisely disposed of the creation of slaves. According to Aristotle, some people are destined by nature to be slaves and others to rule them. Slave labor provides the free with leisure for improvement. From this he concluded that the whole art of the master consisted in the skill of using his slaves. Aristotle gave the science of economy the name oikonomia, from oikos, house, household, and nomos, law. In the period of his lifetime, exchange, trade and usury were quite widely developed, but the economy mainly retained its natural, consumer character. Aristotle considered it natural to acquire goods only through agriculture and handicrafts, and he was a supporter of subsistence economy. But he also understood the nature of exchange. He found it quite natural to exchange for the purpose of consumption, because people generally have more of some things, and some less than are necessary for the satisfaction of wants. He understood the need for money to be exchanged. At the same time, Aristotle considered trade for profit and usury to be reprehensible. These occupations, he pointed out, unlike agriculture and handicrafts, know no limits to the acquisition of wealth. The ancient Greeks already had a well-known idea of the division of labor and the role it played in the life of society. Thus, Plato envisioned the division of labor as the basic principle of the state system in his ideal republic. The economic ideas of the Romans also reflected the relations of the prevailing slave-holding mode of production. Roman writers and public figures, expressing the ideology of slaveholders, considered slaves to be mere instruments of production. It was the Roman writer and encyclopedist Varro, 1st century BC, who, among a number of other books, provided a kind of manual for slave owners on how to conduct agriculture, who made a certain division of tools into 2. Dumb, carts; 3. Emitting inarticulate sounds, cattle; and 4. Gifted with voice, slaves. In giving this definition, he expressed the views that were widespread among slaveholders. The art of slave control occupied the minds of Rome as well as in Greece. The Roman historian Plutarch, 1st-2nd centuries AD, says of the exemplary slave owner Cato that he bought slaves when they were minors, that is, at the age when, like puppies and foals, they can easily be brought up and trained. It goes on to say that among the slaves he was constantly inventing ways of keeping quarrels and arguments going, for he considered concord among them dangerous and feared it. In ancient Rome, especially in the later period, there was no shortage of ominous signs of the collapse and decay of the economy based on the forced labor of slaves. The Roman writer Columella, 1st century AD, complained, "Slaves do the greatest harm to the fields. They lend to the side of the oxen. They and the rest of the cattle graze poorly. They plow the land badly." He was echoed by his contemporary, the writer Pliny the Elder, who claimed that the latifundia ruined Italy and its provinces. Like the Greeks, the Romans considered it natural to have a natural way of farming, in which the owner exchanges only his surplus. In the literature of the time, high trade profits and usurious interest rates were sometimes condemned. In reality, merchants and moneylenders amassed vast fortunes. In the last period of Rome's life, voices were already heard condemning slavery and proclaiming the natural equality of men. Among the ruling class of slaveholders, these views were understandably not sympathetic. As for the slaves, they were so crushed by their servitude, so downtrodden and ignorant, that they could not develop their own, more advanced ideology than the obsolete ideas of the slaveholding class. This is one of the reasons for the spontaneity and disorganization of slave revolts. One of the profound contradictions inherent in the slaveholding system was the struggle between large and small landownership. The ruined peasantry came up with a program of restricting large-scale slaveholding landownership and redistributing land. This was the essence of the agrarian reform for which the Gracchi brothers, 2nd century BC, fought. In the epoch of the disintegration of the Roman Empire, when the absolute majority of the population of cities and villages, both slaves and freemen, saw no way out of the situation, a deep crisis of the ideology of slaveholding Rome began. On the basis of the class contradictions of the dying empire, a new religious ideology arose, Christianity. The Christianity of that era expressed the protest of slaves and other lower classes and declassed elements against slavery and oppression. On the other hand, Christianity reflected the mood of broad strata of the ruling classes, who felt the hopelessness of their situation. That is why in Christianity, in the twilight of the Roman Empire, along with dire warnings against the rich and powerful, there are calls for humility and salvation in the afterlife. In the centuries that followed, Christianity was finally transformed into the religion of the ruling classes, into a spiritual instrument for defending and justifying the exploitation and oppression of the toiling masses. Brief conclusions. 1. The slaveholding mode of production arose due to the growth of the society's productive forces, the emergence of surplus product, the origin of private ownership of the means of production, including land, and the appropriation of the surplus product by the owners of the means of production. Slavery is the first and most brutal form of exploitation of man by man. A slave was the complete and unrestricted property of his master. The slave owner arbitrarily disposed not only of the slave's labor, but also of his life. 2. With the emergence of the slave-holding system, the state was born for the first time. It arose as a result of the division of society into irreconcilably hostile classes as a machine for the suppression of the exploited majority of society by the exploiting minority. 3. Slaveholding economy was mainly subsistence in nature. The ancient world was divided into a multitude of separate economic units that satisfied their needs by their own production. They traded mainly in slaves and luxury goods. The development of exchange gave rise to metallic money. 4. The essential features of the basic economic law of the slaveholding mode of production are approximately as follows. Appropriation by slaveholders of surplus product for their parasitic consumption by means of predatory exploitation of the mass of slaves on the basis of full ownership of the means of production and slaves, by ruining and enslaving peasants and artisans, as well as by conquering and enslaving the peoples of other countries. 5. On the basis of slavery arose a comparatively high culture, art, philosophy, sciences, which reached its greatest development in the Greco-Roman world. Its fruits were enjoyed by a small elite of the slave-holding society. The social consciousness of the ancient world corresponded to a mode of production based on slavery. The ruling classes and their ideologists did not regard the slave as a human being. Physical labor, being the lot of slaves, was considered a shameful occupation, unworthy of a free person. 6. The slave-holding mode of production caused the growth of the society's productive forces in comparison with the primitive communal system. But later on, the labor of slaves, who were not at all interested in the results of production, became obsolete. The spread of slave labor and the disenfranchised position of slaves resulted in the destruction of the main productive force of society, the labor force, and the ruin of small free producers, peasants and artisans. This predetermined the inevitability of the collapse of the slave-holding system. 7. Slave revolts shook the slave-holding system and accelerated its liquidation. The slaveholding mode of production was replaced by the feudal mode of production. The slaveholding form of exploitation was replaced by the feudal form of exploitation, which opened up some space for the further development of the society's productive forces. Chapter 3. The feudal mode of production. The emergence of feudalism. The feudal system existed, with one or another peculiarity, in almost all countries. The era of feudalism covers a long period. In China, the feudal system existed for more than 2,000 years. In Western Europe, feudalism spans a number of centuries. From the fall of the Roman Empire, v. century, to the bourgeois revolutions in England, 17th century, and France, 18th century. In Russia from the X century to the peasant reform of 1861. In Transcaucasia, from the IV century to the 70s of the 19th century, among the peoples of Central Asia. From the 7-8 centuries up to the victory of the proletarian revolution in Russia. In Western Europe, feudalism arose on the basis of the disintegration of the Roman slaveholding society, on the one hand, and the disintegration of the clan system among the conquering tribes, on the other. It was formed as a result of the interaction of these two processes. Elements of feudalism, as already mentioned, originated in the depths of slaveholding society in the form of a colony. Colons were obliged to cultivate the land of their lord, a large landowner, to pay him a certain amount of money or to give him a significant share of the harvest, and to perform various kinds of duties. Nevertheless, the colons were more interested in labor than the slaves, since they had their own households. In this way, new relations of production were born, which were fully developed in the feudal era. The Roman Empire was defeated by tribes of Germans, Gauls, Slavs, and other peoples living in various parts of Europe. The power of the slaveholders was overthrown, and slavery fell away. Large latifundia and craft workshops based on slave labor were fragmented into small ones. The population of the collapsed Roman Empire consisted of large landowners, former slave owners who had switched to the colonnade system, freed slaves, coloni, small peasants, and artisans. At the time of the conquest of Rome, the conquering tribes had a communal system that was in a state of decay. An important role in the social life of these tribes was played by the rural community, which the Germans called the Mark. Land, with the exception of the large landed estates of the nobility, was in communal ownership. Forests, heaths, pastures, ponds were used in common. After a few years, the fields and meadows were divided among the members of the community. But gradually, household land, and then arable land, began to pass into the hereditary use of individual families. The distribution of land, the adjudication of cases concerning the community, and the settlement of disputes between its members were carried out by the community assembly, the elders and judges elected by it. At the head of the conquering tribes were military commanders, who, together with their retinues, owned large lands. The tribes that conquered the Roman Empire took possession of most of its public lands and some of the lands of large private landowners. Forests, meadows and pastures remained in common use, and arable land was divided among individual farms. The divided lands later became the private property of the peasants. In this way a vast stratum of independent small peasantry was formed. But the peasants could not maintain their independence for long. On the basis of private ownership of land and other means of production, property inequality between individual members of the rural community inevitably increased. Well-to-do and poor families appeared among the peasants. With the growth of wealth inequality, the wealthy members of the community began to acquire power over the community. Land was concentrated in the hands of wealthy families and became subject to seizure by the nobility and military leaders. The peasants became personally dependent on the large landowners. In order to retain and strengthen their power over the dependent peasants, the large landowners had to strengthen the organs of state power. Military leaders, relying on the clan nobility and retinues, began to concentrate power in their hands and turned into kings, monarchs. On the ruins of the Roman Empire, a number of new states were formed, headed by kings. The kings generously distributed the land they seized for life, and then as a hereditary possession to their retainers, who had to perform military service for this. Many lands were given to the church, which served as an important pillar of royal power. The land was cultivated by peasants, who now had to perform a number of duties in favor of the new masters. Huge landed estates passed into the hands of royal retinues and servants, church authorities and monasteries. Land distributed under such conditions were called fiefs. Hence the name of the new social order, feudalism. The gradual transformation of peasant land into the property of feudal lords and the enslavement of the peasant masses, the process of feudalization, took place in Europe over the course of a number of centuries, from the 5th and 6th centuries to the 9th and 10th centuries. The free peasantry was ruined by continuous military service, plunder, and extortion. Turning to the large landowner for help, the peasants turned into people dependent on him. Often the peasants were forced to place themselves under the protection of the feudal lord. Otherwise, it would be impossible for a defenseless person to exist in the conditions of continuous wars and robber raids. In such cases, the ownership of the land was transferred to the feudal lord, and the peasant could cultivate this plot only on condition that he fulfilled various duties in favor of the feudal lord. In other cases, royal governors and officials used deception and violence to seize the lands of free peasants and force them to accept their authority. The process of feudalization proceeded differently in different countries, but the essence of the matter was the same everywhere. Previously free peasants fell into personal dependence on the feudal lords who seized their land. This dependence was sometimes weaker, sometimes harsher. In the course of time, the differences in the status of the former slaves, colons, and free peasants were erased, and they all became a single mass of serf peasantry. Gradually, a situation developed that was characterized by the medieval proverb, "There is no land without a seigneur," i.e., without a feudal lord. The kings were the supreme landowners. Feudalism was a necessary stage in the historical development of society. Slavery has outlived its usefulness. Under these conditions, the further development of the productive forces was possible only on the basis of the labor of the mass of dependent peasants, who owned their own farms, their own instruments of production, and who had a certain interest in the labor necessary to cultivate the land and pay tribute to the feudal lord in kind from their harvest. In Russia, under the conditions of the disintegration of the communal system, patriarchal slavery arose. But the development of society here proceeded mainly not along the path of slavery, but along the path of feudalization. From the 3rd century AD, the Slavic tribes attacked the Roman slaveholding empire, fought for the liberation of the cities of the northern Black Sea region under its rule, and played a major role in the collapse of the slaveholding system. The transition from the primitive communal system to feudalism in Russia took place at a time when the slaveholding system had long since fallen and feudal relations in European countries had been strengthened. As the history of mankind shows, it is not necessary for every nation to go through all the stages of social development. For many peoples, conditions arise in which they are able to skip certain stages of development and go directly to a higher stage. The rural community of the Eastern Slavs was called Verv, Mir. The community had meadows, forests, and reservoirs in common use, and arable land began to pass into the possession of individual families. At the head of the community was an elder. The development of private land ownership led to the gradual disintegration of the community. The land was seized by elders and tribal princes. Peasants, SMERDS, were at first free members of the community, and then became dependent on large landowners, boyars. The church became the largest feudal owner. Grants from princes, donations and spiritual testaments made her the owner of vast lands and the richest farms at that time. In the period of the formation of the centralized Russian state, 15th-16th centuries, the Grand Dukes and Tsars began, as it was said at the time, to place their retainers and servants on the land, that is, to give them land and peasants on the condition of military service. Hence the names, estate, landlords. At that time, the peasants were not yet permanently attached to the landlord and the land. They had the right to pass from one landlord to another. At the end of the 1581th century, the landlords, in order to increase the production of grain for sale, intensified the exploitation of the peasants. In this regard, in less than greater than the state deprived the peasants of the right to transfer from one landlord to another. The peasants were completely attached to the land owned by the landlords and thus became serfs. In the era of feudalism, agriculture played a predominant role, and of its branches, agriculture. Gradually, over the course of a number of centuries, the methods of plowing were improved, vegetable gardening, winemaking, and butter-making developed. In the early period of feudalism, the shifting system prevailed, and in the forest areas, the slash-and-burn system of agriculture prevailed. A plot of land was sown for several years in a row with a single crop until the soil was exhausted. Then they moved to another site. Subsequently, there was a transition to a three-field system, in which the arable land is divided into 3 fields, and in turn one field is used for winter crops, another for spring crops and the third remains fallow. The 3-field system began to spread in Western Europe and Russia from the 11th to the 12th centuries. It remained dominant for many centuries, surviving until the 19th century and in many countries to the present day. Agricultural implements in the early period of feudalism were scarce. The tools were a plow with an iron plowshare, a sickle, a scythe, and a shovel. Later, the iron plow and harrow began to be used. Grain grinding was done by hand for a long time, until windmills and watermills became widespread. Production relations of feudal society. Exploitation of peasants by feudal lords. The basis of the production relations of feudal society was the feudal lord's ownership of land and incomplete ownership of the serf peasant. A serf was not a slave. He had his own farm. The feudal lord could no longer kill him, but he could sell him. Along with the property of the feudal lords, there was the sole ownership of the instruments of production in their private economy based on personal labor. Large-scale feudal landed property was the basis for the exploitation of the peasants by the landlords. The feudal Lord's own farm occupied part of his land. The other part of the land was given by the feudal lord under enslaving conditions for the use of the peasants. The peasant was forced to work for the feudal lord because the most important means of production, the land, was the property of the feudal lord. The feudal lord allocated the peasants with land, hence the name allotment. A peasant allotment of land was a condition for providing the landlord with labor. Using his allotment hereditarily, the peasant was obliged to work for the landlord, to cultivate the landlord's land with his own implements and draft animals, or to give the landlord his surplus product in kind or in money. Such a system of economy inevitably implied the personal dependence of the peasant on the landlord, non-economic coercion. If the landlord did not have direct power over the peasant's personality, he would not be able to force the man who is endowed with land and runs his own farm to work for him. 15. The working time of the serf peasant was divided into necessary and surplus time. In the course of the necessary time, the peasant created the product necessary for his own existence and the existence of his family. In the course of surplus time, he created a surplus product, which was appropriated by the feudal lord. The surplus labor of the peasants working in the feudal lord's economy, or the surplus product created by the peasant on his own farm and appropriated by the feudal lord, constitute feudal ground rent. Feudal rent often absorbed not only the surplus labor of the peasant, but also a part of his necessary labor. The basis of this rent was feudal ownership of land, which was associated with the direct domination of the feudal landlord over the peasants dependent on him. Under feudalism, there were three forms of ground rent: labor rent, product rent, and money rent. In all these forms 15 volts. I. Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Essays, Volume 3, p. 159. Of rent, the exploitation of the peasants by the landlords was undisguised. Labor rent prevailed in the early stages of the development of feudalism. It took the form of a corvée. Under the corvée, the peasant worked for a certain part of the week, 3 days or more, with the help of his own instruments of production, plow, draft animals, etc., on the manor's estate, and on the rest of the week he worked on his farm. Thus, under the corvée, the necessary labor and the surplus labor of the peasant were clearly demarcated in time and space. The range of corvée works was very extensive. The peasant plowed, sowed and harvested crops, grazed cattle, worked as a carpenter, cut wood for the landlord, transported agricultural products and building materials on his horse. Under corvée, the serf peasant was interested in increasing labor productivity only while working on his farm. While working on the landlord's land, the peasant had no such interest. The feudal lords maintained overseers who forced the peasants to work. In the course of further development, the labor rent is replaced by the rent of products. Rent in the form of products appeared in the form of rent in kind. The peasant was obliged to regularly deliver to the landlord a certain amount of grain, livestock, poultry, and other agricultural products. The rent was most often combined with some remnants of corvée duties, that is, with the work of the peasant on the landlord's estate. Under the rent of products, the peasant spent all his labor, both necessary and surplus, at his own discretion. Necessary labor and surplus labor were no longer so tangibly separated as in the case of labor rent. The peasant became relatively more independent here. This created some incentives for further increase in labor productivity. At a later stage of feudalism, when exchange was comparatively widespread, money rent arose. It appeared in the form of a monetary tribute. Money rent is characteristic of the period of the disintegration of feudalism and the emergence of capitalist relations. Different forms of feudal rent often existed simultaneously. In all these forms of ground rent, labor rent, rent in products, money rent, as a mere form of rent transformed into products, the payer of rent is always assumed to be the real cultivator and owner of the land, whose unpaid surplus labor goes directly to the owner of the land. 16. In an effort to increase their incomes, the feudal lords levied all sorts of taxes on the peasants. In many cases, they had a monopoly on mills, forges, and other businesses. The peasant was forced to use them for an exorbitant fee in kind or money. In addition to the rent in kind or money paid to the feudal lord, the peasant had to pay all kinds of taxes to the state, local dues, and, in some countries, tithes, that is, a tenth of the harvest, for the benefit of the church. Thus, the basis of the existence of feudal society was the labor of serfs. Peasants produced not only agricultural products. They worked on the estates of feudal lords as artisans, erected castles and monasteries, and laid roads. Cities were built by the hands of serfs. The economy of the feudal lord, especially in the early stages of its development, was essentially a subsistence economy. Each feudal possession, consisting of a manor estate and villages belonging to the feudal lord, lived a separate economic life, rarely resorting to exchange with the outside world. The needs of the feudal lord and his family, the needs of the numerous servants, were at first satisfied by the products that were produced in the lord's household and delivered by the peasants. More or less large estates had a sufficient number of artisans, mostly from among the serfs of the household. These artisans were engaged in the manufacture of clothing and footwear, the production in 16K. Marx, Capital, Volume 3, 1953, page 815. Repair of weapons, hunting equipment and agricultural implements, and the construction of buildings. Peasant farming was also subsistence. Peasants were engaged not only in agricultural labor, but also in domestic handicraft labor, mainly in the processing of raw materials produced on their farms. Spinning, weaving, making shoes, and household implements. For a long time, feudalism was characterized by a combination of agriculture as the main branch of the economy with domestic crafts, which had subsidiary significance. The few imported products that could not be dispensed with, such as salt and iron, were at first brought by itinerant merchants. Subsequently, in connection with the growth of cities and handicraft production, the division of labor and the development of exchange between town and country made a great step forward. The exploitation of dependent peasants by feudal lords was the main feature of feudalism among all peoples. However, in some countries, the feudal system had its own peculiarities. In the countries of the East, feudal relations were for a long time combined with relations of slavery. This was the case in China, India, Japan and a number of other countries. Feudal state ownership of land was of great importance in the East. For example, during the period of the Baghdad Caliphate under the rule of the Arabs, especially in the 8th–9th centuries AD, most of the peasant community members lived on the caliph's land and paid feudal rent directly to the state. Feudalism in the East is also characterized by the persistence of patriarchal clan relations, which were used by the feudal lords in order to intensify the exploitation of the peasants. In the agricultural countries of the East, where irrigated agriculture is crucial, the peasants became indentured to the feudal lords, because not only the land, but also the water resources and irrigation facilities were the property of the feudal state or individual feudal lords. Nomadic peoples used the land as pasture. The size of feudal land ownership was determined by the number of livestock. Large cattle owners, feudal lords, were in fact large owners of pastures. They kept the peasantry dependent and exploited it. Proceeding from the foregoing, it would be possible to formulate the main features of the basic economic law of feudalism in the following way. The appropriation by the feudal lords for their parasitic consumption of the surplus product through the exploitation of dependent peasants on the basis of the feudal lord's ownership of land and his partial ownership of the workers of production, the serfs. Medieval city. Artisans guilds. Merchant guilds. Cities arose under the slave-holding system. Cities such as Rome, Florence, Venice, Genoa, in Italy, Paris, Lyon, Marseille, in France, London in England, Samarkand in Central Asia, and many others were inherited by the Middle Ages from the era of slavery. The slave-holding system fell, but the cities remained. Large slave-holding workshops disintegrated, and non-crafts continued to exist. In the early Middle Ages, cities and crafts developed poorly. Urban artisans produced products for sale, but they received most of the consumer goods they needed from their farms. Many of them had small crops, gardens, and productive livestock. Women were engaged in the yarn of flax and wool for the manufacture of clothes. This was indicative of the limitations of markets and exchange. In the countryside, the processing of agricultural raw materials was at first an auxiliary occupation of farmers. Then, artisans who served their village began to emerge from among the peasants. The productivity of artisans grew. It became possible to produce more products than the feudal lord or the peasants of one village needed. Artisans began to settle around feudal castles, near the walls of monasteries, in large villages and other trade centers. Thus, gradually, usually on waterways, new cities grew up, in Russia, for example, Kiev, Pskov, Novgorod, Vladimir. The separation of the city from the countryside, which had arisen during slavery, intensified. With the passage of time, crafts became more and more profitable. The art of artisans was perfected. The feudal landlord switched to buying handicrafts from the townspeople. He was no longer satisfied with the products of his own serfs. The more developed handicraft was finally separated from agriculture. Cities, having arisen on the lands of secular and ecclesiastical feudal lords, were subject to their authority. The townspeople bore a number of duties in favor of the feudal lord, paid him a rent in kind or in money, and were subordinate to his administration and court. The urban population early began the struggle for liberation from feudal dependence. Partly by force, partly by means of ransom, the cities obtained for themselves the right of self-government, of the courts, of coinage, and of collecting taxes. The urban population consisted mainly of artisans and merchants. In many cities, serfs who fled from the landlords found refuge. The city was the bearer of commodity production, in contrast to the countryside, where natural economy prevailed. The growth of competition on the part of runaway serfs who flocked to the cities, the struggle against exploitation and oppression on the part of feudal lords forced artisans to unite in guilds. The guild system existed in the epoch of feudalism in almost all countries.
Guilds arose in Byzantium in the 9th century, in Italy in the 10th century, and later throughout Western Europe in Russia. In the countries of the East, Egypt, China, in the cities of the Arab Caliphate, guilds appeared even earlier than in European countries. Guilds united urban artisans of one particular trade or several close ones. Only artisans' masters were full members of the guilds. The master craftsman had a small number of apprentices and apprentices. The guilds carefully guarded the exclusive right of their members to engage in this craft and regulated the production process. They established the length of the working day, the number of apprentices and apprentices of each master, determined the quality of raw materials and finished products, as well as its prices, and often they jointly purchased raw materials. Methods of work, enshrined in a long-standing tradition, were obligatory for everyone. Strict regulation was intended to ensure that no master was superior to the rest. In addition, the workshops served as mutual aid organizations. Guilds were a feudal form of craft organization. In the early days of their existence, they played a certain positive role, contributing to the strengthening and development of urban crafts. However, with the growth of commodity production and the expansion of the market, the guilds became more and more a brake on the development of productive forces. Excessive regulation of handicraft production on the part of the guilds fettered the initiative of artisans and hindered the development of technology. In order to limit competition, the workshops began to put all sorts of obstacles in the way of those who wanted to obtain the rights of a foreman. Apprentices and apprentices, whose number had grown greatly, had almost no opportunity to become independent masters. They were forced to remain in the position of wage earners for the rest of their lives. Under these conditions, the relationship between the master and his subordinates lost its former, more or less patriarchal, character. The foreman intensified the exploitation of their subordinates, forcing them to work 14 to 16 hours a day for paltry pay. Apprentices began to unite in secret alliances, brotherhoods, to protect their interests. The guilds and the city authorities persecuted the apprentice brotherhoods in every possible way. The richest part of the urban population were merchants. Trade activity took place both in the cities inherited from the era of slavery and in the cities that arose under feudalism. The guild organization in crafts corresponded to the organization of guilds in trade. Merchant guilds existed almost everywhere in the era of feudalism. In the East, they have been known since the 9th century in Western Europe, from the 9th–10th centuries in Russia, since the 12th century. The main task of the guilds was to combat the competition of foreign merchants, to regulate weights and measures, and to protect merchants' rights from the encroachment of feudal lords. In the 9th and 10th centuries there was already considerable trade between the countries of the East and Western Europe. Kievan Rus took an active part in this trade. The Crusades, 11th–13th centuries, which opened the Middle Eastern markets to Western European merchants, played an important role in the expansion of trade. Europe was flooded with gold and silver from the East. Money began to appear in places where it had not been used before. The Italian cities, especially Genoa and Venice, took a direct part in the conquest of the eastern markets, transporting crusaders to the east on their merchant ships and supplying them with provisions. For a long time, Mediterranean ports were the main centers of trade linking Western Europe with the East. At the same time, trade developed widely in the North German and Dutch cities located near the trade routes of the North and Baltic Seas. In the 80th century, a trade union of cities arose here, the German Hanseatic League, which united about less than greater than cities of various European countries in the next 2 centuries. The Hanseatic League traded with England, Scandinavia, Poland, and Russia. In exchange for Western European handicrafts, Flanders and English cloth, linen, German metalwork, French wines, furs, leathers, lard, honey, bread, timber, resin, linen fabrics and some handicrafts were exported from the northeastern regions of Europe. Merchants brought spices from the countries of the East, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, incense, dyestuffs, paper and silk fabrics, carpets and other goods. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Russian cities of Novgorod, Pskov, and Moscow conducted extensive trade with Asia and Western Europe. Novgorod merchants traded, on the one hand, with the peoples of the north, the coast of the Arctic Ocean and the Trans-Urals, and on the other hand, conducted regular trade with Scandinavia and Germany. The growth of cities and the development of trade had a strong influence on the feudal countryside. The economy of the feudal lords was drawn into the market turnover. To buy luxury goods and urban handicrafts, the feudal lords needed money. In this regard, it was profitable for the feudal lords to transfer the peasants from corvée and natural rent to money rent. With the transition to monetary servitude, feudal exploitation intensified even more. Classes and estates of feudal society. Feudal hierarchy. Feudal society was divided into 2 main classes, feudal lords and peasants. The feudal society represented a division of classes in which the overwhelming majority, the serf peasantry, was completely dependent on an insignificant minority, the landlords who owned the land.
17. The feudal class was not a homogeneous whole. Small feudal lords paid tribute to large feudal lords, helped them. 17 volts. I. Lenin, on the State, Essays, Volume 29, page 445. In war, but at the same time enjoyed their patronage. The patron was called a seigneur, and the patronized was called a vassal. The seigneurs, in turn, were vassals of other, more powerful feudal lords. As the ruling class, the feudal landlords stood at the head of the state. They constituted one estate, the nobility. The nobles held the honorable position of the first estate, enjoying broad political and economic privileges. The clergy, ecclesiastical and monastic, were also the largest landowners. It owned vast lands with a large dependent and serf population and, along with the nobility, was the ruling class. The broad base of the feudal ladder was the peasantry. The peasants were subordinate to the landlord and were under the supreme authority of the largest feudal lord, the king. The peasantry was a politically disenfranchised class. Landlords could sell their serfs and made extensive use of this right. The serfs subjected the peasants to corporal punishment. Lenin called serfdom serf slavery. The exploitation of serfs was almost as brutal as the exploitation of slaves in the ancient world. Nevertheless, the serf could work part of the time on his own land, he could to a certain extent belong to himself. The main class contradiction of feudal society was the contradiction between feudal lords and serfs. The struggle of the exploited peasantry against the feudal landlords was waged throughout the entire epoch of feudalism and became particularly acute at the last stage of its development, when feudal exploitation intensified to the extreme. In the cities that had freed themselves from feudal dependence, power was in the hands of wealthy townspeople, merchants, usurers, owners of urban land and large landowners. Guild artisans, who made up the bulk of the urban population, often opposed the urban aristocracy, seeking their share in the administration of the cities along with the urban aristocracy. Small artisans and apprentices fought against the guild masters and merchants who exploited them. By the end of the feudal era, the urban population was already highly stratified. On one side are rich merchants and guild masters, on the other are vast strata of apprentices and apprentices, the urban poor. The lower classes of the city entered into a struggle against the combined forces of the urban nobility and feudal lords. This struggle was combined with the struggle of the serfs against feudal exploitation. Kings were considered to be the bearers of supreme power, in Russia, Grand Dukes and then Tsars. But outside of the king's own domains, the importance of royalty in the early feudal period was negligible. Often this power remained nominal. The whole of Europe was divided into many large and small states. The great feudal lords were full masters of their domains. They made laws, enforced them, carried out justice and reprisals, maintained their own army, raided their neighbors, and did not hesitate to plunder on the high roads. Many of them minted coins on their own. The lesser feudal lords also enjoyed very broad rights in relation to the people under their rule. They tried to emulate the big seigneurs. In the course of time, feudal relations have formed an extremely intricate tangle of rights and duties. Endless disputes and strife arose between the feudal lords. They were usually resolved by force of arms, by means of internecine wars. Development of productive forces of feudal society. In the era of feudalism, a higher level of productive forces was achieved compared to the era of slavery. In the field of agriculture, the technique of production increased, and the iron plow and other iron tools appeared and became widespread. New branches of field cultivation appeared. Viticulture, winemaking, and vegetable gardening were significantly developed. Cattle breeding, especially horse breeding, which was associated with the military service of feudal lords, grew, and butter making developed. In a number of areas, sheep breeding has become widespread. Meadows and pastures were expanded and improved. Artisan tools and methods of processing raw materials were gradually improved. The former repair shops have become specialized. So, for example, earlier the blacksmith made all products from metal. Over time, weapons, nails, knives, locksmiths were separated from the blacksmith trade, and shoemaking and saddlery were separated from the leather trade. In the 16-17 centuries, self-spinning became widespread in Europe. In 1600 the belt loom was invented. For the improvement of tools, the improvement of smelting and processing of iron was crucial. In the beginning, iron was produced in a very primitive way. In the 14th century, the water wheel began to be used to drive bellows for blowing and heavy hammers for crushing ore. With the increase in draft in the furnaces, instead of forging mass, a fusible mass began to be obtained, cast iron. With the use of gunpowder in warfare and the advent of firearms, in the 14th century, a lot of metal was needed for cannonballs. From the beginning of the 15th century, they began to be cast from cast iron. More and more metal was needed for the manufacture of agricultural and other implements. In the first half of the 15th century, the first blast furnaces appeared. The invention of the compass contributed to the further development of navigation and navigation. The invention and spread of printing was of great importance. In China, the productive forces and culture already reached a significant development in the 6th and 11th centuries, surpassing in many respects the Europe of that time. The Chinese were the first to invent the compass, gunpowder, writing paper and, in its simplest form, printing. The development of the productive forces of feudal society increasingly came up against the narrow framework of feudal relations of production. The peasantry, being under the yoke of feudal exploitation, was not in a position to further increase the production of agricultural products. The productivity of forced peasant labor was extremely low. In the city, the growth of the productivity of the artisan ran into obstacles created by guild statutes and rules. The feudal system was characterized by a slow rate of development of production, routine, and the power of traditions. The productive forces that grew up within the framework of feudal society demanded new relations of production. The origin of capitalist production in the depths of the feudal system. The role of merchant capital. In the epoch of feudalism, there was a gradual development of commodity production, urban handicrafts expanded, and peasant farming became more and more involved in exchange. The production of small artisans and peasants, based on private property and personal labor, creating products for exchange, is called simple commodity production. As already stated, the product produced for exchange is a commodity. Individual commodity producers spend unequal amounts of labor on the production of the same commodities. This depends on the different conditions in which they have to work. Commodity producers, who have better tools, spend less labor on the production of the same commodity than other commodity producers. Along with differences in the instruments of labor, there are also differences in the strength, dexterity, skill of the laborer, etc. But the market does not care under what conditions and with what instruments this or that commodity is produced. The same sum of money is paid for the same commodities on the market, regardless of the individual conditions of labor in which they are produced. That is why commodity producers, whose individual labor inputs are higher than average as a result of the worst conditions of production, cover only a part of these costs when selling their commodities and go bankrupt. On the contrary, commodity producers, whose individual labor inputs are below the average due to better conditions of production, find themselves in an advantageous position and become richer in the sale of their commodities. This increases competition. There is a stratification of small commodity producers. Most of them are getting poorer, and an insignificant part is getting richer. A major obstacle to the development of commodity production was the fragmentation of the state under feudalism. The feudal lords arbitrarily imposed duties on imported goods, levied tribute for passing through their possessions, and thus created serious obstacles to the development of trade. The needs of trade and the economic development of society in general necessitated the abolition of feudal fragmentation. The growth of handicraft and agricultural production and the development of the social division of labor between town and country led to the strengthening of economic ties between different regions within the country and to the formation of a national market. The formation of a national market created economic prerequisites for the centralization of state power. The nascent urban bourgeoisie was interested in the elimination of feudal barriers and advocated the creation of a centralized state. Relying on a wider stratum of non-noble landlords, on the vassals of their vassals, as well as on the rising cities, the kings dealt decisive blows to the feudal nobility and strengthened their position. They became not only nominal, but also de facto rulers in the state. Large nation-states were formed in the form of absolutist monarchies. The overcoming of feudal fragmentation and the creation of centralized state power contributed to the emergence and development of capitalist relations. The formation of the world market was also of great importance for the emergence of the capitalist system. In the second half of the 15th century, the Turks captured Constantinople and the entire eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. The most important artery that carried trade routes between Western Europe and the East was cut. In search of a sea route to India, Columbus discovered America in 1492, and in 1498 Vasco da Gama, having traveled around Africa, discovered a sea route to India. As a result of these discoveries, the center of gravity of European trade shifted from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, and the main role in trade passed to the Netherlands, England, and France. Russia played a prominent role in European trade. With the advent of world trade and the world market, handicrafts were unable to meet the increased demand for goods. This accelerated the transition from small-scale handicraft production to large-scale capitalist production based on the exploitation of wage workers. The transition from the feudal mode of production to the capitalist mode of production took place in two ways. On the one hand, the stratification of small commodity producers gave rise to capitalist entrepreneurs, and on the other hand, merchant capital, in the person of merchants, directly subordinated production to itself. Guilds could limit competition and stratification of. With the development of exchange, the competition became more and more intense. Craftsmen working for a wider market partly sought the abolition of guild restrictions, and partly simply circumvented them. They lengthened the working day of apprentices and apprentices, increased their number, and applied more productive methods of labor. The richest craftsmen were gradually transformed into capitalists, and the poorer masters, apprentices, and apprentices into wage laborers. Merchant capital, by disintegrating natural economy, contributed to the emergence of capitalist production. Merchant capital initially acted as an intermediary in the exchange of goods of small producers, artisans and peasants, and in the realization by feudal lords of a part of the surplus product appropriated by them. Subsequently, the merchant began to regularly buy goods from small producers and then resell them on a wider market. The merchant thereby became a buyer. With the growth of competition and the appearance of the buyer, the position of the mass of artisans changed significantly. Impoverished craftsmen were forced to turn for help to a merchant buyer, who lent them money, raw materials and materials on the condition that the finished products were sold to them at a predetermined, low price. In this way, small producers became economically dependent on merchant capital. Gradually, many impoverished craftsmen became so dependent on the rich buyer. The buyer would give them raw materials, such as yarn, to be processed into cloth for a fee, and thus become a distributor. The ruin of the artisan led to the fact that the buyer supplied him not only with raw materials, but also with tools of labor. Thus the artisan was deprived of the last semblance of independent existence and was finally transformed into a wage worker, and the buyer became an industrial capitalist. Yesterday's artisans, gathered in the capitalist's workshop, did the same work. Soon, however, it was discovered that some of them were better at some operations, others at other operations. For this reason it was more advantageous to entrust to each one that part of the work in which he was most skillful. Thus, in workshops with a more or less significant number of workers, the division of labor was gradually introduced. Capitalist enterprises employing hired workers who work by hand on the basis of the division of labor are called manufactories. 18. The first manufactories appeared in the 14-15 centuries in Florence and some medieval cities republics of Italy. Then, in the 16-18 centuries, manufactories of various branches of production, cloth, linen, silk, watchmaking, weapons, glass, spread to all European countries. In Russia, manufactories began to appear in the 17th century. At the beginning of the 18th century, under Peter I, they began to develop more rapidly. Among them were manufactories of weapons, cloth, silk and others. Ironworks, mines, and salt works were established in the Urals. Unlike Western European manufactories, which were based on hired labor, Russian enterprises in the 17-18 centuries, although they used freelance labor, but the labor of serfs and attached workers prevailed. Since the end of the 18th century, manufactories based on free labor began to spread widely. This process was especially intensified in the last decades before the abolition of serfdom. In contrast to Western European manufactories, which were based on hired labor, Russian enterprises in the 17th and 18th centuries, although free hired labor was used, but the labor of serfs and attached workers prevailed. From the end of the 18th century, manufactories based on hired labor. 18. The word manufactory literally means manual labor, began to spread widely. This process intensified especially in the last decades before the abolition of serfdom. The process of disintegration of feudal relations also took place in the countryside. With the development of commodity production, the power of money increased. Feudal lords and serfs transferred the rent and other duties from the form in kind to the monetary one. Peasants had to sell the products of their labor and pay the proceeds to the feudal lords. The peasants were in constant need of money. This was used by hoarders and usurers to enslave the peasants. Feudal oppression intensified, and the situation of the serfs deteriorated. The development of monetary relations gave a strong impetus to the differentiation of the peasantry, that is, to its stratification into various social groups. The overwhelming majority of the peasantry was impoverished, suffocated by overwork, and ruined. At the same time, kulaks, peace eaters, began to appear in the village, exploiting their fellow villagers by means of enslaving loans, buying agricultural products, livestock, and implements from them for a pittance. Thus, in the depths of the feudal system, capitalist production was born. Initial accumulation of capital, forcible dispossession of peasants, accumulation of wealth. Capitalist production presupposes two basic conditions. 1. The existence of a mass of propertyless people, who are personally free and at the same time deprived of the means of production and the means of subsistence, and are therefore compelled to work for the capitalists, and 2. The accumulation of the monetary wealth necessary for the creation of large capitalist enterprises. We have seen that capitalism was nourished by small-scale commodity production based on private property, with its competition, which enriched the few and ruined the majority of the small producers. But the slowness of this process did not correspond to the needs of the New World market created by the great discoveries of the late 15th century. The emergence of the capitalist mode of production was hastened by the use of the crudest methods of violence on the part of the big landowners, the bourgeoisie, and the state power in the hands of the exploiting classes. Violence, as Marx put it, played the role of midwife, hastening the birth of a new, capitalist mode of production. Bourgeois scholars idyllically depict the history of the emergence of the capitalist class and the working class. In ancient times, they argue, there was a handful of diligent and thrifty people who amassed wealth through their labor. On the other hand, there was a mass of idlers, who squandered all their wealth and turned into propertyless proletarians. These fables of the defenders of capitalism have nothing to do with reality. As a matter of fact, the formation of a mass of propertyless people, the proletarians, and the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few took place through the forcible deprivation of the means of production of the small producers. The process of separating the producers from the means of production, from the land, from the instruments of production, etc., was accompanied by an endless series of robberies and cruelties. This process is called the initial accumulation of capital, because it preceded the creation of large-scale capitalist production. Capitalist production reached a considerable development first of all in Britain. In this country, since the end of the 15th century, there has been a painful process of forced dispossession of the peasants. The immediate impetus for this was the increased demand for wool from the large cloth manufactories that sprang up first in Flanders and then in England itself. Landlords began to breed large flocks of sheep. Pastures were needed for sheep breeding. The feudal lords drove the peasants out of their homes en masse, seized the lands that were in their permanent use, and turned arable land into pastures. The expulsion of peasants from the land was carried out in various ways, primarily through the open seizure of communal land. Landlords fenced off these lands, destroyed peasant houses, and forcibly evicted peasants. If the peasants tried to reclaim the land illegally seized from them, the armed forces of the state came to the aid of the feudal lord. The state authorities began to issue laws in the 18th century on the enclosure of land, sanctifying the robbery of peasants. The ruined and robbed peasants made up the innumerable crowds of destitute poor who filled the towns, villages and roads of England. Having no means of subsistence, they were beggars. The state authorities issued bloody laws against the expropriated. These laws were extremely cruel. So, in the reign of the English King Henry VIII, 16th century, 72,000 people were executed for vagrancy. In the 18th century, vagabonds and homeless people were imprisoned in workhouses instead of the death penalty, which earned the fame of houses of horror. Thus the bourgeoisie tried to accustom the rural population, deprived of land and turned into vagabonds, to the discipline of hired labor. In Tsarist Russia, which embarked on the path of capitalist development later than other European countries, the separation of the producer from the means of production was carried out in the same way as in other countries. In 1861, the Tsarist government, under the influence of peasant uprisings, was forced to abolish serfdom. This reform was a grandiose robbery of the peasants. The landlords seized 2/3 of the land, leaving only 1/3 for the use of the peasants. The most convenient lands, as well as, in some cases, pastures, watering holes, roads to the fields, etc., which were in the use of the peasants, were cut off by the landlords. In the hands of the landlords, the cut-offs became a means of enslaving the peasants, who were forced to rent these lands from the landlords on the most onerous terms. The law, declaring the personal freedom of the peasants, temporarily preserved corvée and rent. For the reduced allotment of land received, the peasant was obliged to bear these duties in favor of the landlord until the land was redeemed. The amount of redemption payments was calculated at inflated land prices and amounted to about 2 billion rubles. Describing the peasant reform of 1861, Lenin wrote, "This is the first mass violence against the peasantry in the interests of the emerging capitalism in agriculture. This is the landlord's cleansing of the land for capitalism." 19. By dispossessing the peasants of their land, a double result was achieved. On the one hand, the land fell into the private ownership of a relatively small handful of landowners. A state feudal ownership of land was transformed into bourgeois property. On the other hand, there was an abundant influx of free workers into industry who were ready to work for the capitalists. For the emergence of capitalist production, it was necessary, in addition to the availability of cheap labor power, to accumulate in a few hands large amounts of wealth in the form of sums of money, which could be converted into any means of production and used to hire workers. In the Middle Ages, great monetary wealth was accumulated by merchants and moneylenders. These riches 19 volts. I. Lenin, Agrarian Program of Social Democracy in the First Russian Revolution of 1905 to 1907, Works, Volume 13, page 250. Later served as the basis for the organization of many capitalist enterprises. The conquest of America, accompanied by the mass plunder and extermination of the native population, brought the conquerors untold riches, which began to grow even faster as a result of the exploitation of the richest mines of precious metals. The mines needed workers. The native population, the Indians, perished en masse, unable to endure the hard labor conditions. European merchants organized a hunt for Negroes in Africa, which was conducted according to all the rules of hunting for wild animals. The trade in Negroes taken from Africa and turned into slaves was extremely profitable. The profits of slave traders reached fabulous proportions. On the cotton plantations of America, the slave labor of Negroes began to be widely used. Colonial trade was also one of the most important sources of the formation of large fortunes. For trade with India, Dutch, English, and French merchants organized the East India Companies. These companies had the support of their governments. They were granted a monopoly on the trade in colonial goods and the right to exploit the colonies without restraint by any means of violence. The profits of the East India Companies amounted to hundreds of % per annum. In Russia, large profits were brought to merchants by predatory trade with the population of Siberia and by the predatory system of wine purchases, which consisted in the fact that the state granted private entrepreneurs the right to produce and sell alcoholic beverages for a certain fee. As a result, huge monetary wealth was concentrated in the hands of merchant and usurious capital. Thus, at the cost of plunder and ruin of the mass of small producers, the monetary wealth necessary for the creation of large-scale capitalist enterprises was accumulated. Describing this process, Marx wrote, "Newborn capital exudes blood and dirt from all its pores, from head to toe." 20. Uprisings of serfs. Bourgeois revolutions. The death of the feudal system. The struggle of the peasantry against the feudal landlords took place throughout the entire era of feudalism, but it became particularly acute by the end of this era. France in the 14th century was gripped by a peasant war, which went down in history under the name Jacquerie. The nascent urban bourgeoisie supported this movement at first, but at the decisive moment withdrew from it. In England, at the end of the 14th century, a peasant uprising broke out, covering most of the country. Armed peasants led by Wat Tyler marched across the country, smashing down estates and monasteries, and captured London. The feudal lords resorted to violence and deception to put down the rebellion. Tyler was treacherously murdered. Believing the promises of the king and the feudal lords, the rebels went home. After that, punitive expeditions passed through the villages, which committed cruel reprisals against the peasants. Germany at the beginning of the 16th century was engulfed in a peasant war, supported by the urban lower classes. At the head of the rebels was Thomas Munzer. The peasants demanded the abolition of noble arbitrariness and violence. In Russia, the peasant wars led by Stepan Razin in the 17th century and Yemelyan Pugachev in the 18th century were particularly large. The rebellious peasants sought the abolition of serfdom, the transfer of landlords and state-owned lands to them, and the elimination of the rule of landlords. The aggravation of the crisis of the feudal serf system of economy 20K. Marx, Capital, Volume I, 1953, page 764. In the 1950s was reflected in a broad wave of peasant uprisings on the eve of the reform of 1861. Large-scale peasant wars and uprisings have been taking place in China for hundreds of years. The Taiping Rebellion during the Qing dynasty, mid-19th century, involved millions of peasants. The rebels occupied the ancient capital of China, Nanjing. The Taiping agrarian law proclaimed equality in the use of land and other property. The Taiping state organization combined monarchy with peasant democracy in a peculiar way, which is typical of peasant movements in other countries. The revolutionary significance of the peasant uprisings lay in the fact that they shook the foundations of feudalism and eventually led to the abolition of serfdom. The transition from feudalism to capitalism in the countries of Western Europe took place through bourgeois revolutions. The struggle of the peasants against the landlords was used by the rising bourgeoisie to hasten the demise of the feudal system, to replace feudal exploitation by capitalist exploitation, and to seize power in its own hands. In bourgeois revolutions, the peasants formed the bulk of the fighters against feudalism. This was the case in the First Bourgeois Revolution in the Netherlands, Holland and Belgium, in the 16th century. Such was the case in the English Revolution of the 17th century. This was the case in the bourgeois revolution in France at the end of the 18th century. The bourgeoisie took advantage of the fruits of the peasantry's revolutionary struggle, making its way to power on its shoulders. The peasants were strong in their hatred of their oppressors. But the peasant uprisings were spontaneous. The peasantry, as a class of small private proprietors, was fragmented and unable to create a clear program and a strong, cohesive organization for the struggle. Peasant uprisings can succeed only if they are combined with the working class movement and if the workers lead the peasant uprisings. But in the period of the bourgeois revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, the working class was still weak, small and unorganized. In the depths of feudal society, more or less ready-made forms of the capitalist order matured, a new exploiting class, the capitalist class, and at the same time there appeared masses of people deprived of the means of production, the proletarians. In the epoch of bourgeois revolutions, the bourgeoisie used against feudalism the economic law of the obligatory correspondence of the relations of production to the character of the productive forces, overthrew the feudal relations of production, created new, bourgeois relations of production, and brought the relations of production into conformity with the character of the productive forces that had matured in the bosom of feudalism. Bourgeois revolutions put an end to the feudal system and established the rule of capitalism. Economic views of the feudalistic era. The economic views of the feudal epoch reflected the prevailing system of social relations at that time. In feudal society, all intellectual life was under the control of the clergy and proceeded in a religious scholastic form. For this reason, discussions of the economic life of that time formed special sections in theological treatises. The economic and other views of the feudal era in China were influenced by the teachings of Confucius for many centuries. Confucianism as a religious ideology arose as early as the V century BC. The socio-economic views of Confucianism boiled down to the consecration of a single feudal state under the rule of a monarch and demand the strict preservation of the feudal hierarchy of estates both in the state structure and in family life. In the words of Confucius, "Dark people must obey aristocrats and sages. The disobedience of the commoner to the higher is the beginning of disorder." Confucius and his followers, defending the interests of the feudal exploiters, idealized the most backward, conservative forms of economy. They praised the golden age of patriarchal antiquity. In its development, Confucianism became the official ideology of the feudal nobility. One of the ideologists of feudalism in medieval Europe, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, tried to justify the necessity of feudal society by divine law. By declaring feudal property necessary and reasonable and declaring serfs to be slaves, Thomas Aquinas, in contrast to the ancient slaveholders, asserted that in his spirit the slave is free and therefore the master has no right to kill the slave. Work was no longer considered unworthy of a free man. Thomas Aquinas viewed physical labor as menial labor and mental labor as noble labor. In this division he saw the basis for the class division of society. In his views on wealth, the same feudal class approach was manifested. Each person should have wealth in accordance with the position he occupies on the feudal hierarchical ladder. From this point of view, the teaching of medieval theologians about the so-called just price is characteristic. A fair price should reflect the amount of labor expended in the production of the commodity and the class position of the producer. The medieval advocates of a just price had no objection to merchants' profits. They only sought to bring profit within such limits that it would not threaten the economic existence of other estates. They condemned usury as a base and immoral occupation. However, with the development of commodity production and exchange, the clergy themselves began to take part in usurious operations. At the same time, the attitude of the church to usury became more and more tolerant. The class struggle of the oppressed and exploited masses against the ruling classes of feudal society developed in a religious form for a number of centuries. The demands of exploited peasants and apprentices were often justified by quotations from the Bible. All sorts of sects were very widespread. The Catholic Church and the Inquisition brutally persecuted heretics and burned them at the stake. With the development of the class struggle, the religious form of the movement of the oppressed masses receded into the background, and the revolutionary character of this movement became more and more evident. The peasants demanded the abolition of serf slavery, the abolition of feudal privileges, the establishment of equal rights, the abolition of estates, and so on. In the course of the peasant wars in Britain, the Czech Republic, and Germany, the slogans of the insurgents assumed an increasingly radical character. The striving of the exploited masses of the countryside and the city for equality was expressed in the demand for community of property. It was the desire for equality in consumption. Although the demand for community of property was impracticable, it had a revolutionary significance in that historical epoch, since it roused the masses to struggle against feudal oppression. At the end of the feudal era, two outstanding early utopian socialists emerged: the Englishman Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, 16th century, and the Italian Tommaso Campanella, whose book is called The City of the Sun, 17th century. Seeing the growing inequality and contradictions of contemporary society, these thinkers expounded their views on the causes of social disasters in a peculiar form. They gave a description of the ideal, in their opinion, social order under which these disasters would be eliminated. The books of these utopians describe a social order free from private property and all its attendant vices. Everyone in this society is engaged in both handicraft and agricultural work. All the inhabitants work 6 or even 4 hours a day. And the fruits of their labor are quite sufficient to satisfy all wants. Products are distributed according to need. The upbringing of children is a public affair. The works of More and Campanella played a progressive role in the development of social thought. They contained ideas that were far ahead of the development of society at that time. But More and Campanella did not know the laws of social development. Their ideas were unrealizable, utopian. At that time, social inequality could not be abolished. The level of productive forces required a transition from feudal to capitalist exploitation. The emergence of capitalism dates back to the 16th century. The first attempts to comprehend and explain a number of phenomena of capitalism belong to the same century. This is how the trend of economic thought and politics known as mercantilism was born and developed in the 16th and 18th centuries. Mercantilism originated in England, then it appeared in France, Italy, and other countries. The mercantilists raised the question of the wealth of the country, of the forms of wealth, and of the ways in which it grows. It was a time when capital, in the form of trade and usurious capital, dominated the sphere of trade and credit. In the field of production, however, he took only the first steps, founding manufactories. After the discovery and conquest of America, a flood of precious metals poured into Europe. Gold and silver were then continuously redistributed among the individual European states, both through war and through foreign trade. In their understanding of the nature of wealth, the mercantilists proceeded from the superficial phenomena of circulation. They did not concentrate on production, but on trade and the circulation of money, especially on the movement of gold and silver. In the eyes of the mercantilists, the only true wealth was not social production and its products, but money, gold and silver. The mercantilists demanded that the state actively intervene in economic life so that as much money as possible would flow into the country and as little as possible would go out of it. The early mercantilists sought to achieve this by purely administrative measures prohibiting the export of money from the country. Later mercantilists considered it necessary to expand foreign trade for this purpose. For example, the English representative of mercantilism, Thomas Maine, 1571 to 1641, a major merchant and director of the East India Company, wrote, "The common means of increasing our wealth and our treasures is foreign trade, in which we must always adhere to the rule that we annually sell to foreigners more of our goods than we consume their goods." The mercantilists expressed the interests of the bourgeoisie, which was emerging in the bosom of feudalism, and sought to accumulate wealth in the form of gold and silver through the development of foreign trade, colonial plunder and trade wars, and the enslavement of backward peoples. In connection with the development of capitalism, they began to demand that the state power should patronize the development of industrial enterprises, i.e., manufactures. Export premiums were established, which were paid to merchants selling goods on the foreign market. Import duties soon became even more important. With the development of manufactories and then factories, the imposition of duties on imported goods became the most common measure of protection of domestic industry from foreign competition. Such a protective policy is called protectionism. In many countries, it persisted long after the notions of mercantilism had been overcome. In England, protective duties were of great importance in the 16th and 17th centuries, when she was threatened by competition from the more advanced manufactures of the Netherlands. Since the 18th century, England has been firmly conquering industrial primacy. Other, less developed countries could not compete with it. In this regard, the ideas of free trade began to make their way in England. A different situation arose in the countries which embarked on the capitalist path later than Britain. For example, in France in the 17th century, Louis XIV's minister, Colbert, who actually ruled the country, created an extensive system of state patronage of manufactures. His system included high import duties, a ban on the export of raw materials, the introduction of a number of new industries, the creation of companies for foreign trade, and so on. Mercantilism played a progressive role for its time. Protectionist policies, inspired by the ideas of mercantilism, contributed greatly to the spread of manufactures. But the mercantilists' views on wealth reflected the underdevelopment of capitalist production at that time. The further development of capitalism more and more clearly revealed the inconsistency of the ideas of the mercantile system. In Russia in the 17th and 18th centuries, the feudal serf system of economy prevailed. The economy was basically subsistence. At the same time, trade and handicrafts were significantly developed, a national market was formed, and manufactories began to appear. These economic changes in the country contributed to the strengthening of absolutism in Russia. Reflecting the historical and economic features of the country, representatives of Russian economic thought developed some ideas of mercantilism. However, unlike many Western European mercantilists, they attached great importance not only to trade, but also to the development of industry and agriculture. The economic views of that time found their expression in the works and activities of the Russian statesmen of the 17th century A.L. Orden Nashchokin, in the economic policy of Peter the Great, in the works of the greatest Russian economist of the early 18th century I.T. Posashkov, in his work The Book of Poverty and Riches, 1724, I.T. Posashkov outlined an extensive program of Russia's economic development and gave a detailed justification for this program. Posashkov argued for the need to carry out a number of economic measures in Russia aimed at protecting the development of domestic industry, trade, agriculture, and improving the country's financial system. In the last third of the 18th century, there was a tendency towards the disintegration of feudal-serf relations in Russia, which sharply intensified in the first quarter of the 19th century, and later grew into a direct crisis of serfdom. The initiator of the revolutionary democratic trend in Russian social thought, A.N. Radashev, 1749–1802, was an outstanding economist of his time. Resolutely opposing serfdom and defending the oppressed peasantry, Radashev gave a devastating critique of the feudal system, exposed the exploitative character of the wealth of the feudal landlords, owners of manufactures and merchants, and substantiated the ownership of land by those who cultivated it by their own labor. Radashev was firmly convinced that autocracy and serfdom could be abolished only by revolutionary means. He developed a progressive system of economic measures for his time, the implementation of which would ensure Russia's transition to a bourgeois democratic system. The Decembrists, who came out in the first half of the 19th century, were revolutionary figures of that historical period in Russia when the need to replace feudalism with capitalism was imminent. They directed the spearhead of their criticism against serfdom. Being ardent advocates of the development of Russia's productive forces, they considered the abolition of serfdom and the emancipation of the peasants to be the most important condition for this development. The Decembrists not only put forward the slogan of struggle against serfdom and autocracy, but also organized an armed uprising against the absolutist monarchy. P.I. Pestel, 1793–1826, developed an original project for solving the agrarian question in Russia. Pestel's draft constitution, which he called Russkaya Pravda, provided for the immediate and complete emancipation of the peasants from serfdom, as well as economic measures aimed at protecting the interests of the peasants in the future. To this end, Pestel considered it necessary to create a special public land fund, from which every peasant could receive free of charge for his use the land necessary for his subsistence. This fund must be formed at the expense of a part of the landlord's lands in the treasury, and a part of the land of the largest landlords must be alienated free of charge. The Decembrists, as revolutionaries who came from among the nobility, were far from the people, but their ideas of struggle against serfdom contributed to the growth of the revolutionary movement in Russia. Under the conditions of the disintegration of feudalism and the birth of the capitalist system, the ideology of the bourgeoisie was formed, rising to its own domination. This ideology was directed against the feudal system and against religion as an ideological tool of the feudal lords. As a result, the worldview of the bourgeoisie fighting for power in a number of countries was progressive. Its most prominent representatives, economists and philosophers, strongly criticized all the foundations of feudal society: economic, political, religious, philosophical, and moral. They played an important role in the ideological preparation of the bourgeois revolution, exerting a progressive influence on the development of science and art. Brief conclusions. 1. Feudalism arose on the basis of the disintegration of slave-holding society and the disintegration of the rural community of tribes that conquered slave-holding states. In those countries where there was no slave-holding system, feudalism arose on the basis of the disintegration of the primitive communal system. The tribal nobility and tribal warlords seized a large amount of land and distributed it to their retainers. There was a gradual enslavement of the peasants. 2. The basis of production relations of feudal society was the feudal lord's ownership of land and incomplete ownership of the production worker, the serf peasant. Along with feudal property, there was also the sole property of the peasant and artisan, based on personal labor. The labor of serfs was the basis of the existence of feudal society. Serfdom exploitation was expressed in the fact that the peasants were forced to serve in favor of the feudal lord corvée, or to pay him rent in kind and money. Serfdom was often not much different from slavery for the peasant. However, the serfdom system opened up some opportunities for the development of productive forces, since the peasant was able to work on his own farm for a certain part of the time and had some interest in labor. 3. The main features of the basic economic law of feudalism are approximately as follows. Appropriation by feudal lords of surplus product for their parasitic consumption through the exploitation of dependent peasants on the basis of the feudal lord's ownership of land and his incomplete ownership of production workers, serfs. 4. Feudal society, especially in the early Middle Ages, was fragmented into small principalities and states. The ruling classes of feudal society were the nobility and the clergy. The peasant class had no political rights. Throughout the history of feudal society, there has been a class struggle between peasants and feudal lords. The feudal state, expressing the interests of the nobility and the clergy, was an active force that helped them to strengthen the right of feudal ownership of land and to intensify the exploitation of the disenfranchised and oppressed peasants. 5. In the era of feudalism, agriculture played a predominant role, and the economy was mainly subsistence in nature. With the development of the social division of labor and exchange, the old cities that had survived the fall of the slave-holding system were revived, and new cities appeared. Cities were centers of crafts and trade. The craft was organized into guilds, which sought to prevent competition. Merchants united in merchant guilds. 6. The development of commodity production, disintegrating the natural economy, led to the differentiation of peasants and artisans. Merchant capital accelerated the disintegration of handicrafts and contributed to the emergence of capitalist enterprises. Manufactures. Feudal restrictions and fragmentation hindered the growth of commodity production. In the course of further development, a national market was formed.
A centralized feudal state arose in the form of absolutist monarchies. 7. The primitive accumulation of capital prepared the conditions for the emergence of capitalism. Huge masses of small producers, peasants and artisans, were deprived of the means of production. The great monetary wealth concentrated in the hands of large landowners, merchants, and usurers was created through the forcible dispossession of the peasantry, colonial trade, taxes, and the slave trade. In this way the formation of the main capitalist classes was accelerated: wage earners and capitalists. In the depths of feudal society, more or less ready-made forms of the capitalist system grew up and matured. 8. Production relations of feudalism, low productivity of forced labor of serfs, guild restrictions. The revolts of the serfs shook the feudal system and led to the abolition of serfdom. At the head of the struggle for the overthrow of feudalism stood the bourgeoisie. It used the revolutionary struggle of the peasants against the feudal lords to seize power.
The bourgeois revolutions put an end to the feudal system, established the rule of capitalism, and opened the way for the development of the productive forces.
Section 2. The capitalist mode of production. A. Pre-monopoly capitalism. Chapter IV. Commodity production, goods and money. Commodity production is the starting point of the emergence and the general feature of capitalism. The capitalist mode of production, which has replaced the feudal mode of production, is based on the exploitation of the wage worker class by the capitalist class. In order to understand the essence of the capitalist mode of production, it is necessary first of all to bear in mind that the capitalist system is based on commodity production. Here everything takes the form of a commodity. The principle of buying and selling prevails everywhere. Commodity production is older than capitalist production. It existed under the slave-holding system and under feudalism. In the period of the disintegration of feudalism, simple commodity production served as the basis for the emergence of capitalist production. Simple commodity production presupposes, firstly, the social division of labor, in which individual producers create heterogeneous products, and, secondly, the existence of private ownership of the means of production and the products of labor. Simple commodity production of artisans and peasants differs from capitalist production in that it is based on the personal labor of the commodity producer. At the same time, it is fundamentally identical to capitalist production, since it is based on private ownership of the means of production. Private property inevitably gives rise to competition between commodity producers, which leads to the enrichment of the minority and to the ruin of the majority. In view of this, small-scale commodity production serves as the starting point for the emergence and development of capitalist relations. Under capitalism, commodity production assumes a dominant, universal character. The exchange of commodities, Lenin wrote, is the simplest, the most ordinary, the most basic, the most massive, the most commonplace, the relation of bourgeois, commodity, society, which occurs billions of times. 21. The product and its properties. The dual character of labor embodied in the commodity. A commodity is a thing which, in the first place, satisfies some human need, and, in the second place, is produced not for one's own consumption, but for exchange. The utility of a thing, its properties by virtue of which it can satisfy this or that need of people, make a thing a use value. Use value can either directly satisfy a person's personal need or serve as a means of producing material goods. For example, bread satisfies the need for food, cloth satisfies the need for clothing. The use value of the loom consists in the fact that fabrics are produced with it. In the course of historical development, man discovers new useful properties of things and ways of using them. Many things that are not at all created by human labor, such as the water in a spring or the fruits of wild trees, have a use value. But not everything that has a use value is a commodity. In order for a thing to become a commodity, it must be a product of labor produced for sale. 21. Use value constitutes the material content of wealth, whatever may be its social form. In commodity economy, use value is the carrier of the exchange value of the commodity. Exchange value is primarily represented as a quantitative relation in which the use values of one kind are exchanged for the use values of another kind. For example, one axe is exchanged for 20 kilograms of grain. It is in this quantitative relation of the commodities exchanged that their exchangeable value is expressed. Commodities in certain quantities are equated with each other, hence they have a common basis. The physical properties of commodities determine their utility, their use value, and the use value of commodities is incomparable and quantitatively incommensurable. Different commodities have only one property in common which makes them comparable in exchange, namely, that they are products of labor. The equality of the two exchanged commodities is based on the social labor expended in their production. When a commodity producer brings an axe to the market for exchange, he finds that his axe is worth 20 kilograms of grain. This means that an axe costs as much social labor as 20 kilograms of grain. The exchange value of a commodity, therefore, is the form in which its value is manifested. Value is the social labor of commodity producers embodied in the commodity.
That the value of commodities is determined by the labor expended in their production is confirmed by well-known facts. Material goods, which are useful in themselves, but do not require the expenditure of labor, have no value, like air. Material goods that require a lot of labor have a high value, such as gold and diamonds. Many commodities, formerly expensive, have fallen considerably in price since the development of technology has reduced the amount of labor required to produce them. Behind the exchange of commodities lies the social division of labor between the people who are the owners of these commodities. Commodity producers, by equating different commodities with one another, thereby equate their different kinds of labor. Thus, the relations of production between commodity producers are expressed in value. These relations manifest themselves in the exchange of goods. A commodity has a dual character. On the one hand, it is a use value, and on the other hand, it is a value. The dual character of the commodity is due to the dual character of the labor embodied in the commodity. The kinds of labor are as varied as the use values produced. The work of a carpenter is qualitatively different from that of a tailor, shoemaker, etc. Different kinds of work differ from each other in their aim, methods, tools, and, finally, results. A carpenter works with an axe, a saw, a planer and produces wood products, tables, chairs, cabinets. A tailor makes clothes with the help of a sewing machine, scissors, and a needle. Thus in every use value a certain kind of labor is embodied. In the table, the labor of the carpenter; in the suit, the labor of the tailor; in the footwear, the labor of the shoemaker, and so on. Concrete labor creates the use value of the commodity. In exchange, the most diverse commodities produced by different kinds of concrete labor are compared with each other and equated with each other. Behind the different kinds of labor, therefore, there is something common to all labor. Both the work of the carpenter and the work of the tailor, in spite of the qualitative difference between these kinds of labor, is the productive expenditure of the human brain, nerves, muscles, etc., and in this sense is the same human labor, labor in general. The labor of commodity producers, which appears as an expenditure of human labor power in general, regardless of its concrete form, is abstract labor. Abstract labor forms the value of the commodity. Abstract labor and concrete labor are the two aspects of labor embodied in the commodity. All labor is, on the one hand, the expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense of the word, and in this capacity it is equal or abstractly human. Labor constitutes the value of commodities. All labor, on the other hand, is the expenditure of human labor power in a particularly purposeful form, and in this capacity of concrete useful labor it creates use values. 22. In a society dominated by private ownership of the means of production, the dual nature of the labor embodied in the commodity reflects the contradiction between the private and social labor of the commodity producers. Private ownership of the means of production separates people, makes the labor of the individual commodity producer his private affair. Each commodity producer conducts his economy separately from the others. The work of individual workers is not coordinated and linked across society. But, on the other hand, the social division of labor means the existence of a comprehensive connection between producers who work for each other. The more labor is divided in a society, the greater the variety of products produced by individual producers, the greater their mutual dependence on each other. Consequently, the labor of an individual commodity producer is essentially social labor, a part of the labor of society as a whole. The contradiction of commodity production, therefore, lies in the fact that the labor of commodity producers, being their direct private affair, is at the same time of a social character. But this social character of labor in the process of production remains latent until the commodity enters the market and is exchanged for another commodity. It is only in the process of exchange that it is discovered whether the labor of this or that commodity producer is 22K. Marx, Capital, Volume I, 1953, page 53. Necessary for society and whether it will receive social recognition. Abstract labor, which forms the value of commodities, is a historical category peculiar only to commodity economy. In the natural economy, people produce products not for exchange, but for their own consumption, as a result of which the social character of their labor appears directly in its concrete form. For example, the feudal lord is interested in the labor of the serf mainly as concrete labor that creates certain products, which he appropriates in the form of corvée or rent. On the contrary, in commodity production, products are produced not for one's own consumption, but for sale. The social character of labor is revealed only on the market by the equalization of one commodity to another, and this assimilation takes place by the reduction of concrete kinds of labor to abstract labor, which forms the value of the commodity. This process takes place spontaneously, as if behind the backs of commodity producers. Simple and complex work. Socially necessary working time. Workers of various qualifications are involved in the production of goods. The work of a worker who does not have any special training is simple work. Work that requires special training is complex or skilled work. Complex labor creates a greater value per unit of time than simple labor. The value of the commodity created by complex labor includes part of the labor spent on the training of the worker. The reduction of all kinds of complex labor to simple labor is accomplished by spontaneous means. Complex labor acquires the significance of multiplied simple labor. An hour of complex labor is equal to several hours of simple labor. The magnitude of the value of the commodity is determined by the working time. The more time it takes to produce a given product, the higher its cost. It is known that individual commodity producers work under different conditions and spend different amounts of working time on the production of the same goods. Does this mean that the lazier the worker, the less favorable conditions he works in, the higher the value of the commodity will be? No, it doesn't. The magnitude of the value of a commodity is determined not by the individual labor time spent on the production of the commodity by an individual commodity producer, but by the socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary labor time is the time required for the production of a commodity under the average social conditions of production, i.e., at an average level of technique, average skill and intensity of labor. Socially necessary labor time changes as a result of an increase in labor productivity. Labor productivity is determined by the amount of output created per unit of working time. The productivity of labor increases as a result of the improvement or fuller use of the instruments of production, the development of science, the improvement of the skill of the worker, the rationalization of labor, and other improvements in the process of production. The higher the productivity of labor, the shorter the time required to produce a unit of a given commodity, the lower the value of that commodity. Labor intensity is determined by labor inputs per unit of time. The more labor is expended per unit of time, the greater is the magnitude of the value created, which is embodied in a greater quantity of commodities produced. Development of forms of value. The essence of money. The value of a commodity is created by labor in the process of production, but it can only be manifested through the equation of one commodity with another in the process of exchange, i.e., through exchange value. The simplest form of value is the expression of the value of one commodity in another commodity, e.g., 1 axe equals 20 kilograms of grain. Let's take a look at this form. Here, the value of the axe is expressed in grain. Grain serves as a means of expressing the value of an axe. The expression of the value of the axe in terms of the use value of the grain is possible only because labor has been expended in the production of grain, as well as in the production of the axe. A commodity which expresses its value in another commodity, in our example, an axe, is in the relative form of value. A commodity whose use value serves as a means of expressing the value of another commodity, in our example, grain, is in an equivalent form. Grain is the equivalence, of another commodity, an axe. The use value of one commodity, grain, thus becomes the form of expression of the value of another commodity, the axe. Initially, exchange, which originated in primitive society, was of an accidental character and took place in the form of a direct exchange of one product for another. Corresponding to this stage in the development of exchange is the simple or accidental form of value. 1 axe equals 20 kilograms of grain. In the simple form of value, the value of the axe can only be expressed in terms of the use value of a single commodity, in this example, grain. With the growth of the social division of labor, exchange becomes more regular. Individual tribes, such as pastoral tribes, begin to produce a surplus of livestock products, for which they exchange the agricultural or handicraft products they lack. Corresponding to this stage in the development of exchange is the complete or expanded form of value. Not two, but a number of goods are involved in the exchange. Equals 40 kilograms of grain, 1 sheep equals 20 meters of canvas, equals 2 axes, equals 3 grams of gold. Here the value of a commodity finds its expression in the use value, not of one, but of many commodities which play the role of an equivalent. At the same time, the quantitative relations in which commodities are exchanged become more constant. At this stage, however, there is still a direct exchange of one commodity for another. With the further development of the social division of labor and commodity production, the form of direct exchange of one commodity for another becomes insufficient. In the process of exchange, difficulties arising from the growth of the contradictions of commodity production. More and more often a situation arises when, for example, the owner of boots needs an axe, while the owner of the axe does not need boots, but grain. A transaction between these two owners of commodities cannot take place. Then the owner of the boots exchanges the boots for such a commodity as most often enters into the exchange. And everyone willingly takes it, say, for a sheep, and then exchanges the axe he needs for this sheep. The owner of the axe, having received a sheep in exchange for the axe, exchanges it for grain. The direct exchange of one commodity for another gradually disappears. From among commodities there is one, for example, cattle, for which all commodities begin to be exchanged. Corresponding to this stage in the development of exchange is the general form of value. 40 kilograms of grain equals or 20 meters of canvas equals or 1 sheep 2 axes equals or 3 grams of gold equals etc. The general form of value is characterized by the fact that all commodities begin to be exchanged for a commodity which plays the role of a universal equivalent. At this stage, however, the role of universal equivalent has not yet been assigned to any one commodity. In different localities, different commodities played the role of a universal equivalent. In some places, cattle, in others, furs, in others, salt, and so on. Further growth of productive forces led to the development of commodity production and the expansion of the market. The abundance of different commodities playing the role of a universal equivalent came into conflict with the needs of a growing market, which demanded a transition to a single equivalent. This role was gradually assigned to the precious metals, silver and gold. When the role of the universal equivalent was assigned to a single commodity, for example, gold, the money form of value appeared. 40 kilograms of grain equals or 20 meters of canvas equals or 3 grams of gold, 1 sheep equals or 2 axes equals, etc. The value of all commodities is now expressed in terms of the use value of gold, which has become the universal equivalent. Money is a commodity, which is the universal equivalent for all commodities. They embody social labor and express the relations of production between commodity producers. With the advent of money, the world of commodities is divided into two poles. At one pole there are all ordinary commodities. At the other pole there is a commodity that plays the role of money. Functions of money. With the spread of commodity production, the functions performed by money develop. In developed commodity production, money serves as 1. A measure of value, 2. A means of circulation, 3. A means of accumulation, 4. A means of payment, and 5. World money. The main function of money is that it serves as a measure of the value of commodities. With the help of money, spontaneous accounting and measurement of the value of all goods is carried out. The value of a commodity cannot be expressed directly in terms of labor time, since in the conditions of isolation and fragmentation of private commodity producers it is impossible to determine the amount of labor that not an individual commodity producer, but society as a whole spends on the production of this or that commodity. For this reason, the value of a commodity can be expressed only indirectly, by equating the commodity with money in the process of exchange. In order to perform the function of a measure of value, money itself must be a commodity, possess value. Just as the weight of a body can only be measured by a weight that has weight, so the value of a commodity can only be measured by a commodity that has value. The measurement of the value of commodities by means of gold takes place even before the commodity is exchanged for money. In order to express the value of goods in money, it is not necessary to have cash on hand. In fixing a certain price for a commodity, the owner mentally or, as Marx says, ideally, expresses the value of the commodity in terms of gold. This is possible because in reality there is a certain correlation between the value of gold and the value of a given commodity. This ratio is based on the socially necessary labor expended on their production. The value of a commodity, expressed in terms of money, is called its price. Price is the monetary expression of the value of a commodity. Commodities express their values in definite quantities of silver or gold. These quantities of the monetary commodity must in turn be measured. Hence the need for a unit of measurement for money. Such a unit is a certain weight quantity of the monetary metal. In England, for example, the unit of currency is called the pound sterling. It once corresponded to a pound of silver. Subsequently, monetary units were separated from weight units. This was the result of the borrowing of foreign coins, the transition from silver to gold, and chiefly the deterioration of the coins by governments, which gradually reduced their weight. For the convenience of measurement, monetary units are divided into smaller parts. The ruble, by 100 kopecks, the dollar, by 100 cents, the franc, by 100 centime, etc. The monetary unit, with its divisions, serves as the scale of prices. As a scale of prices, money plays an entirely different role than as a measure of value. As a measure of value, money measures the value of other commodities, and as a scale of prices, it measures the quantity of the monetary metal itself. The value of the commodity of money changes with the change in the quantity of labor socially necessary for its production. Changes in the value of gold do not affect its price scale function. No matter how the value of gold changes, a dollar is always 100 times larger than a cent. The state can change the gold content of the monetary unit, but it cannot change the value between gold and other commodities. If the government reduces the amount of gold contained in the monetary unit, i.e., lowers its gold content, the market will react by raising prices, and the value of the commodity will continue to be expressed in terms of such a quantity of gold as corresponds to the labor expended on the commodity. Only now, more monetary units are required to express the same amount of gold than before. Commodity prices can rise or fall under the influence of changes in both the value of commodities and the value of gold. The value of gold, like all other commodities, depends on the productivity of labor. Thus, the discovery of America, with its rich gold deposits, and in particular the discovery of Brazilian mines in the 17th century, led to a revolution in prices. Gold was mined in America with less difficulty than in Europe. The influx of cheaper American gold into Europe caused a general rise in prices. Money performs the function of a medium of circulation. The exchange of commodities by means of money is called the circulation of commodities. The circulation of commodities is inseparably bound up with the circulation of money itself. When a commodity passes from the hands of the seller to the hands of the buyer, the money passes from the hands of the buyer to the hands of the seller. The function of money as a medium of circulation is that it acts as an intermediary in the process of circulation of commodities. To perform this function, the money must be available. Originally, in the exchange of goods, money appeared directly in the form of silver or gold ingots. This created difficulties in the exchange, the need to weigh the monetary metal, break it into small pieces, and establish the sample. Gradually, ingots of monetary metal were replaced by coins. A coin is an ingot of metal of a certain shape, weight, and value, which serves as a legal medium of circulation. The minting of coins was concentrated in the hands of the state. In the process of circulation, coins are worn out from use and lose some of their value. The practice of money circulation has shown that worn coins can perform the function of a medium of circulation on a par with full-fledged coins. This is due to the fact that money plays a fleeting role in the function of a medium of circulation. As a rule, the seller of a product takes money in exchange for it in order to buy another product with this money. Consequently, money as a medium of circulation must not necessarily have a value of its own. Taking into account the practice of circulation of worn coins, governments began to deliberately deface the coin, reduce its weight, and reduce the fineness of the monetary metal, without changing the nominal value of the coin, that is, the number of monetary units indicated on it. Coins became more and more a sign of value, a sign of money. Their real value is much lower than what they represent nominally. The bifurcation of commodities into commodities and money marks the development of the contradictions of commodity production. In the direct exchange of one commodity for another, each transaction is isolated, the sale is inseparable from the purchase. Exchange by means of money, i.e., the circulation of commodities, is a different matter. Here, exchange presupposes a comprehensive connection between commodity producers and the incessant interweaving of their transactions. It opens up the possibility of separating the sale from the purchase. A commodity producer can sell his goods and delay the money received for them for the time being. When many commodity producers sell without buying, there may be a delay in the sale of goods. Thus, the possibility of crises is already inherent in the simple circulation of commodities. However, in order to transform this possibility of crises into their inevitability, a number of conditions are necessary, which arise only with the transition to the capitalist mode of production. Money has the function of a store of value, or a means of hoarding. Since money is the universal representative of wealth, it can always be converted into any commodity. Money becomes a treasure when it is withdrawn from circulation. They can be stored in any quantity. Commodity producers accumulate money, for example, to buy means of production or as savings. Only full-fledged money can perform the function of a treasure, gold and silver coins, gold and silver ingots, as well as gold and silver items. Money serves as a means of payment. Money acts as a means of payment in cases when the purchase and sale of goods is made on credit, that is, with a deferred payment. In the case of a purchase on credit, the transfer of goods from the hands of the seller to the hands of the buyer is made without immediate payment for the purchased goods. When the payment for the purchased goods is due, the money is paid by the buyer to the seller without the transfer of the goods that took place earlier. Money is also a means of payment in the payment of taxes, ground rent, etc. The function of money as a means of payment reflects the further development of the contradictions of commodity production. Ties between individual commodity producers are becoming wider, and their dependence on each other is growing. Now the buyer becomes a debtor, the seller becomes a creditor. When many commodity owners buy goods on credit, the failure of one or more debtors to pay the bill on time can affect the entire chain of payment obligations and cause the bankruptcy of a number of commodity owners connected with each other by credit relations. In this way, the possibility of crises, which is already inherent in the function of money as a medium of circulation, is strengthened. An examination of the functions of money as a medium of circulation and as a means of payment makes it possible to elucidate the law which determines the quantity of money necessary for the circulation of commodities. Goods are bought and sold in many places at the same time. The amount of money required for circulation at a given moment depends primarily on the sum of the prices of the goods in circulation, which in turn depends on the quantity of goods and on the price of each individual product. In addition, it is necessary to take into account the speed with which money circulates. The faster money circulates, the less it is needed for circulation, and vice versa. If, for example, during a given period, say, a year, goods worth $1 billion are sold, and each dollar on average makes 5 revolutions, then $200 million will be required to circulate the entire mass of goods. Thanks to the credit provided by commodity producers to each other, the need for money is reduced by the sum of the prices of commodities sold on credit and by the amount of mutually repayable payments. Cash is required only to pay off those debts that are due. Thus, the law of the circulation of money is that the quantity of money required for the circulation of commodities must be equal to the sum of the prices of all the units of money of the same name. In this case, it is necessary to subtract from the sum of the prices of all commodities the sum of the prices of the commodities sold on credit and the amount of mutually redeemable payments, and add the sum of payments for which payment has come due. This law is of universal importance for all social formations with commodity production and circulation. Finally, money plays the role of world money in the circulation between countries. The role of world money cannot be fulfilled by inferior coins or paper money. On the world market, money sheds its form of coin and appears in its original form, ingots of precious metals. On the world market, gold is the universal means of purchase, the universal means of payment, and the universal embodiment of social wealth. The development of the functions of money expresses the growth of commodity production and its contradictions. Under the conditions of commodity production based on private ownership of the means of production, money becomes a means of exploitation of man by man. Gold and paper money. When gold coins are used as money, their quantity is spontaneously adapted to the needs of commodity circulation. With a decrease in the production of goods and a decrease in turnover, a part of the gold coins goes out of circulation and turns into a treasure. When production expands and turnover increases, these coins re-enter circulation. With the development of commodity production, paper money is often used instead of gold coins for purchases and payments. The issue of paper money was generated by the practice of circulating worn out and depreciated coins, which were turned into tokens of gold, into tokens of money. Paper money is a state-issued, obligatory banknote that replaces gold in its function as a medium of circulation. Paper money has no intrinsic value. They cannot, therefore, function as a measure of the value of commodities. Whatever amount of paper money is issued, it represents only the value of the quantity of gold which is necessary to service the circulation of goods. Paper money is not redeemable for gold. If paper money is issued according to the quantity of gold required for circulation, then the purchasing power of paper money, i.e., the quantity of commodities that can be bought with it, coincides with the purchasing power of gold money. But usually the state issues paper money to cover its expenses, especially in times of war, crisis, and other upheavals, regardless of the needs of trade. In the contraction of production and the circulation of commodities, or in the issuance of an excessive quantity of paper money, there is more of it than the quantity of gold required for circulation. Let's say that twice as much money is issued as necessary. In this case, each paper currency unit, dollar, mark, franc, etc., would represent half the amount of gold, i.e., the paper money would be worth half as much. The first attempts to issue paper money date back to the end of the 17th beginning of the 18th century. In the USA, in 1692, due to the war against Canada, in France, in 1716. England entered the path of issuing paper money during the Napoleonic Wars. In Russia, paper money was first issued under Catherine II. The excessive issue of paper money, which causes its depreciation and is used by the ruling classes to shift the state expenditure onto the shoulders of the working masses and to intensify their exploitation, is called inflation. Inflation, which causes a rise in food prices, hits the working people the hardest, since the wages of workers and employees lag behind the rise in prices. The capitalists and landlords benefit from inflation. The law of value is the economic law of commodity production. In a commodity economy based on private property, the production of commodities is carried out by separate private commodity producers. There is a competitive struggle between commodity producers. Each strives to push aside the other, to maintain and expand its position in the market. Production is carried out without any general plan. Everyone produces on his own, independently of the others. No one knows what the demand for the commodity he produces is, and how many other commodity producers are engaged in the production of the same commodity, whether he will be able to sell the commodity on the market and whether the labor he has expended will be replaced. With the development of commodity production, the power of the market over commodity producers is becoming more and more strengthened. This means that in commodity production, which is based on private ownership of the means of production, the economic law of competition and anarchy of production operates. This law expresses the spontaneous character of production and exchange, the struggle between private commodity producers for more favorable conditions for the production and sale of commodities. Under the conditions of anarchy of production reigning in a commodity economy based on private property, the law of value, acting through market competition, acts as a spontaneous regulator of production. The law of value is the economic law of commodity production, according to which the exchange of commodities takes place in accordance with the quantity of socially necessary labor expended on their production. The law of value spontaneously regulates the distribution of social labor and means of production among the various branches of commodity economy through the mechanism of prices. Under the influence of fluctuations in the relation of supply and demand, the prices of commodities are constantly deviating up or down from their value. Deviations of prices from value are not the result of a defect in the operation of the law of value, but, on the contrary, the only possible way of its realization. In a society where production is in the hands of private owners working blindly, only spontaneous fluctuations in prices on the market let commodity producers know which products are produced in excess or insufficient quantities in comparison with the effective demand of the population. Only spontaneous fluctuations of prices around value force commodity producers to expand or reduce the production of certain commodities. Under the influence of price fluctuations, commodity producers rush to those industries that seem to be more profitable at the moment. On the basis of the law of value, the productive forces of commodity economy are developed. As is well known, the magnitude of the value of a commodity is determined by socially necessary labor. Commodity producers, who for the first time employ higher techniques, produce their commodities at lower costs as compared with socially necessary expenditures, and they sell these commodities at prices corresponding to socially necessary labor. When they sell goods, they get a surplus of money and get rich. This encourages other producers to introduce technical improvements at their enterprises. Thus, as a result of the disparate actions of individual commodity producers striving for personal benefit, the progress of technology takes place, and the productive forces of society develop. As a result of competition and anarchy of production, the distribution of labor and means of production between branches and the development of productive forces in commodity economy is achieved by the accumulation of great losses of social labor and leads to an ever greater aggravation of the contradictions of this economy. Under the conditions of commodity production based on private property, the operation of the law of value leads to the emergence and development of capitalist relations. Spontaneous fluctuations of market prices around value, deviations of individual labor inputs from socially necessary labor, which determines the magnitude of the value of commodities, intensify economic inequality and the struggle between commodity producers. Competition leads to the fact that some commodity producers go bankrupt and perish, while others enrich themselves. The operation of the law of value thus causes stratification among commodity producers. Small-scale production gives birth to capitalism and the bourgeoisie constantly, daily, hourly, spontaneously and on a mass scale. 23. Commodity fetishism. Under the conditions of commodity production, which is based on private ownership of the means of production, the social bond between people that exists in the process of production is manifested only through the exchange of things commodities. The fate of commodity producers turns out to be closely connected with the fate of the things created by them, commodities. Prices for commodities 23 volts. I. Lenin, Infantile Disease of Leftism, in Communism, Works, Volume 31, pp. 7-8. Change continuously regardless of the will and consciousness of people, and yet the price level is often a matter of life and death for commodity producers. The relations of things disguise the social relations of men. So, the cost of the goods. It expresses the social relation between commodity producers, and it appears to be as natural a property of a commodity as, say, its color or weight. Thus, in a commodity economy based on private property, the relations of production of people inevitably appear as relations between things, commodities. In this objectification of the relations of production lies the commodity fetishism inherent in commodity production. 24. Commodity fetishism is especially evident in money. In the commodity economy, money is a great power that gives power over people. Money can buy everything. This ability to buy everything is pretended to be a natural property of gold, but in reality it is the result of certain social relations. Commodity fetishism has deep roots in commodity production, where the labor of the commodity producer directly appears as private labor and its social character is manifested only in the exchange of commodities. It is only with the abolition of private ownership of the means of production that commodity fetishism disappears. Brief conclusions. 1. The starting point of the emergence of capitalism was the simple commodity production of artisans and peasants. Simple commodity production differs from capitalist production in that it is based on the personal. 24. The reification of relations of production inherent in commodity production is called commodity fetishism, because of its similarity to religious fetishism, which consists in the deification by primitive people of objects made by themselves. Labor of the commodity producer. At the same time, it is fundamentally the same as capitalist production, since it is based on private ownership of the means of production. Under capitalism, when not only the products of labor, but also labor power become a commodity, commodity production assumes a dominant, universal character. 2. A commodity is a product produced for exchange. It represents, on the one hand, a use value, and on the other, a value. The labor which creates the commodity has a dual character. Concrete labor is labor expended in a definite form. It creates the use value of the commodity. Abstract labor is the expenditure of human labor power in general. It creates the value of the commodity. 3. The contradiction of simple commodity production lies in the fact that the labor of commodity producers, being their direct private affair, at the same time has a social character. Value is the social labor of commodity producers embodied in the commodity. Value is a historical category peculiar only to commodity economy. The magnitude of the value of a commodity is determined by the labor socially necessary for its production. 4. The development of the contradictions of commodity production leads to the fact that one commodity spontaneously emerges from the environment of commodities, which becomes money. Money is a commodity that plays the role of a universal equivalent. Money performs the following functions. 1. A measure of value. 2. A medium of circulation. 3. A means of accumulation. 4. A means of payment. And 5. A means of world money. 5. With the growth of money circulation, paper money appears. Paper money, having no intrinsic value, is a sign of metalogical money and replaces it as a medium of circulation. Excessive issuance of paper money, which causes its depreciation, inflation, leads to a decrease in the standard of living of the working people. 6. In a commodity economy based on private ownership of the means of production, the law of value is a spontaneous regulator. The law of value regulates the distribution of social labor and the exchange of commodities by means of constant fluctuations in prices. The operation of the law of value determines the stratification of small commodity producers and the development of capitalist relations. Chapter V. Capitalist Simple Cooperation and Manufacture. Capitalist Simple Cooperation. Capitalism first subordinates production as it finds it, i.e., with the backward technique of handicraft and small peasant farming, and only later, at a higher stage of its development, does it transform it on new economic and technical foundations. The development of capitalist production in industry is characterized by the following three main stages. 1. Capitalist simple cooperation. 2. The manufacturing period. And 3. The machine period. Capitalist production begins where the means of production are concentrated in private hands and the workers, deprived of the means of production, are forced to sell their labor power as a commodity. In handicraft production and in peasant trades, comparatively large workshops belonging to capitalists are formed. The capitalists expand the scope of production, without at first changing either the instruments or the methods of labor of the small producers. This initial stage in the development of capitalist production is called capitalist simple cooperation. Simple capitalist cooperation is a form of socialization of labor in which the capitalist exploits a more or less considerable number of wage laborers employed at the same time and performing homogeneous work. Capitalist simple cooperatives arise on the basis of the disintegration of small-scale commodity production. The first capitalist enterprises were founded by merchants, buyers, usurers, rich craftsmen, artisans and handicraftsmen. Bankrupt artisans, apprentices who had lost the opportunity to become independent masters, and the rural poor worked at these enterprises. Capitalist simple cooperation has advantages over small-scale commodity production. The association of many workers in one enterprise results in savings in the means of production. It is cheaper to build, heat and light one workshop for 20 people than to build and maintain 10 workshops for 2 workers each. The cost of tools, storage facilities, transportation of raw materials and finished products is also reduced. The results of the work of an individual artisan depend entirely on his individual characteristics, strength, dexterity, art, etc. Under the conditions of primitive technology, these differences between workers are very great. For this reason alone, the position of the small producer is extremely precarious. Commodity producers who expend more labor on the production of the same type of commodity than is required under the average conditions of production are inevitably ruined. If there are many workers in the workshop, the individual differences between them are smoothed out. The labor of individual laborers deviates in one direction or another from the average social labor, but the aggregate labor of many laborers employed at the same time more or less corresponds to the average socially necessary labor. As a result, the production and sale of the commodities of the capitalist workshop become more regular and durable. With simple cooperation, labor is saved and its productivity increases. Let's take the example of passing bricks manually along a chain of workers. Each individual worker here performs the same movements, but his actions are part of the same general operation. As a result, things go much faster than when everyone individually carries a brick. 10 men working together produce more in a working day than the same 10 men working separately from each other, or than 1 man in 10 working days of the same duration. Cooperation makes it possible to carry out work simultaneously over a large area, for example, in the drainage of swamps, the construction of dams, canals, railways, and also makes it possible to expend a considerable amount of labor in a small space, for example, in the construction of buildings or in the cultivation of labor-intensive crops. Cooperation is of great importance in those branches of production where certain works must be carried out in a short time, for example, harvesting, shearing sheep, etc. The simultaneous employment of a large number of workers makes it possible to carry out such work in a short time and thereby prevent large losses. In this way, cooperation gave rise to a new social productive force of labor. Simply combining the efforts of individual workers led to an increase in productivity. This gave the owners of the first capitalist workshops the opportunity to produce goods cheaper and successfully compete with small producers. The results of the new social productive power of labor were appropriated by the capitalist gratuitously and served the purposes of his enrichment.
The manufacturing period of capitalism. The development of simple capitalist cooperatives led to the emergence of manufactures. Manufacture is capitalist cooperation based on the division of labor and handicraft technique. Manufacture as a form of the capitalist process of production prevailed in Western Europe from about the middle of the 16th century to the last third of the 18th century. It is the second, higher, stage of the development of capitalist production. Manufacture arose in two ways. The first way is for the capitalist to unite artisans of different specialties in one workshop. Thus arose, for example, the carriage manufactory, which united within its walls formerly independent artisans, carriage makers, saddlers, tailors, locksmiths, coppersmiths, turners, clerks, glazers, painters, varnishers, etc. In manufactory, the production of the carriage is divided into a large number of different complementary operations, each of which is performed by a separate worker. As a consequence, the former character of handicraft work is changing. For example, a locksmith for a long time is now engaged only in a certain operation in the manufacture of carriages, and gradually ceases to be the locksmith who previously made the finished goods himself. The second way is for the capitalist to unite artisans of the same specialty in one workshop. Previously, each of the artisans independently carried out all operations for the production of this product. The capitalist divides the process of production in the workshop into a number of separate operations, each of which is entrusted to a specialist worker. This is how the needle manufactory, for example, came into being. In the needle manufactory, the wire passed through the hands of 72 or more workers. One pulled, another straightened the wire, a third cut it, a fourth sharpened the ends, and so on. The manufactory division of labor is the division of labor within an enterprise in the production of the same commodity, as opposed to the division of labor in society between individual enterprises in the production of different commodities. The division of labor within manufacture presupposes the concentration of the means of production in the hands of the capitalist, who is at the same time the owner of the commodities produced. A hired worker, unlike a small commodity producer, does not produce commodities on his own. It is only the common product of the labor of many workers that becomes a commodity. The division of labor within society presupposes the fragmentation of the means of production between separate, independent commodity producers. The products of their labor, e.g., that of a carpenter, a tanner, a shoemaker, or a farmer, appear as commodities, and the connection between independent commodity producers is established by means of the market. The worker who performs a separate operation in the manufacture of a commodity is a part-time worker. By constantly repeating the same simple operation, he spends less time and effort on it than an artisan who performs a number of different operations in turn. At the same time, when there is specialization, work becomes more intensive. Previously, the worker spent a certain amount of time switching from one operation to another, changing tools. In the manufactory, these losses of labor time were reduced. Gradually, specialization spread not only to the worker, but also to the instruments of production. They were perfected, more and more adapted to the partial operation for which they were intended. All this led to a further increase in labor productivity. A striking example is the manufacture of needles. In the 18th century, a small manufactory with 10 workers produced 48,000 needles per day under the division of labor, which means that there were 4,800 needles per worker. Without the division of labor, however, one worker would not be able to produce even 20 needles a day. The specialization of labor in the manufactory, associated with the constant repetition of the same simple movements, disfigured the worker physically and mentally. There were workers with a curved spine, with a compressed chest, and so on. Thus, the increase in labor productivity in the manufactory was achieved by crippling the worker. Manufacture turns the worker into a freak, artificially, cultivating in him only one-sided skill and suppressing the whole world of his productive inclinations and talents. 25. The workers of the manufactory were brutally exploited. The working day was 18 hours or more. Wages were extremely low. The overwhelming majority of manufacturing workers lived from hand to mouth. The new, capitalist discipline of labor was introduced by the most ruthless measures of coercion and violence. The manufacturing division of labor, wrote Marx, creates new conditions for the domination of capital over labor. If, therefore, on the one hand, it is a historical progress and a necessary moment in the economic development of society, on the other hand it is an instrument of civilized and refined exploitation. 26. In slaveholding and feudal societies there were two types of capital, trade and usury. The emergence of capitalist production meant the emergence of industrial capital. Industrial capital is capital employed in the production of commodities. One of the characteristic features of the manufacturing period of capitalism is the close and indissoluble connection between commercial and industrial capital. The owner of the manufactory almost always acted as a buyer. He resold raw materials to small commodity producers, distributed the material to houses for dressing, or bought individual parts of products from small commodity producers, bought products from them for subsequent resale.
The sale of raw materials and the purchase of products were intertwined with usurious bondage. This greatly worsened the position of the small producer, led to a lengthening of his working day and to a decrease in his earnings. 25K. Marx, Capital, Volume I, 1953, page 368. 26 Ibid, page 372. Capitalist work at home. In the manufacturing period of capitalism, the distribution of work to the home was very widespread. Capitalist work at home is the domestic processing of material received from the employer for piecework. This form of exploitation was encountered occasionally in simple cooperation. It also takes place in the period of large-scale machine industry, but it is characteristic of manufacture. Capitalist work at home appears here as an appendage of manufacture. The manufactory division of labor divided the production of each commodity into a series of separate operations. Often it was advantageous for the buyer manufacturer to set up a comparatively small workshop, where only the assembly or final finishing of the goods was carried out. All preparatory operations were carried out by artisans and handicraftsmen who worked in their own homes, but were completely dependent on the capitalist. Often, the artisans, scattered in different villages, did not deal with the owner of the assembly workshop, but with intermediaries craftsmen who additionally exploited the handicraftsmen. Handicraftsmen and artisans who worked at home received wages from the capitalist, which were much lower than the wages of the worker employed in the capitalist's workshop. Masses of peasants were involved in the trade, and the need for money forced them to look for a side job. In order to earn a small amount of money, the peasant was exhausted and forced all the members of his family to work. Excessively long working hours, unsanitary working conditions, the most ruthless exploitation. These are the distinguishing features of capitalist work at home. These features characterize numerous handicrafts in Tsarist Russia. The buyers, who were the actual masters of handicrafts in a village or district, made extensive use of the division of labor among the handicraftsmen. For example, in the Zavyalov's establishment in Pavlovo, in the assembly workshop of which more than 60 workers were employed in the 100s of the last century, an ordinary penknife passed through the hands of 8 to 9 handicraftsmen. A farrier, a climber, a cutting maker, a hardener, a glosser, a finisher, a guide, and a brander worked on it. At the same time, a considerable number of part-time workers were employed not in the capitalist's workshop, but in their own homes. In the same way, carriage fishing, felting, a number of woodworking, shoemaking, buttoning, etc., were organized. Numerous examples of the cruel exploitation of handicraftsmen are given by V.I. Lenin in his work The Development of Capitalism in Russia. For example, in the Moscow province in the early 80s of the last century, 37.5 thousand workers were engaged in unwinding paper yarn, knitting and other women's crafts. Children started working at the age of 5 or 6. The average daily wage was 13 kopecks, the working day was up to 18 hours. The historical role of the manufactory. Manufacture was a transitional form from small-scale production by artisans and handicraftsmen to large-scale capitalist machine industry. Manufactory was similar to handicraft in that it was based on manual technique, and from the capitalist factory in that it was large-scale production based on the exploitation of hired workers. The manufacturing division of labor was a significant step forward in the development of society's productive forces. But manufacture, based on manual labor, was not in a position to supplant small-scale production. Typical of capitalist manufacture is a small number of comparatively large establishments, together with a considerable number of small ones. A certain part of the commodities was produced by manufacturers, and the overwhelming majority were still supplied by artisans and handicraftsmen, who were in varying degrees dependent on capitalists, buyers, distributors, and manufacturers. Thus, manufacture could not embrace social production in its entirety. It was like a superstructure. Small-scale production with its primitive technique was still the basis. The historical role of manufacture has been to prepare the necessary conditions for the transition to machine production, and in this respect 3 circumstances are particularly important. In the first place, manufacture, by bringing the division of labor to a high degree, simplified many labor operations. They were reduced to such simple movements that it became possible to replace the hands of the worker with a machine. Secondly, the development of manufacture led to the specialization of tools, to their considerable improvement, as a result of which the transition from hand tools to machines was possible. Thirdly, the manufacture has trained a cadre of skilled workmen for the large-scale machine industry, owing to their long specialization in the performance of particular operations. Small-scale commodity production, capitalist simple cooperatives, and manufacture with its appendage, capitalist work at home, are now widespread in the economically backward and underdeveloped countries, India, Turkey, Iran, and others. Disintegration of the peasantry. Transition from corvée to capitalist farming. In the manufacturing period of the development of capitalism, industry became more and more isolated from agriculture. The growth of the social division of labor led to the fact that not only industrial products, but also agricultural products were transformed into commodities. In agriculture, there was a specialization of regions by crops and branches. Regions of commercial agriculture arose: flax growing, sugar beet production, cotton growing, tobacco growing, dairy farming, cheese making, etc. On this basis, exchange developed not only between industry and agriculture, but also between various branches of agriculture. The further commodity production penetrated into agriculture, the stronger the competition between farmers became. The peasant became more and more dependent on the market. Spontaneous fluctuations in prices on the market intensified and exacerbated property inequality among the peasants. In the hands of the well-to-do upper class of the village, free money was accumulating. This money was used for enslavement and exploitation of poor peasants and turned into capital. One of the means of such enslavement was the purchase of the products of the peasants' labor for a pittance. Gradually, the ruin of the peasants reached such an extent that many of them were forced to abandon their farms altogether and sell their labor power. Thus, with the development of the social division of labor, with the growth of commodity production, the process of disintegration of the peasantry took place. Capitalist relations were taking shape in the countryside, and new social types of the rural population were emerging, which constituted the classes of capitalist society, the rural bourgeoisie and the agricultural proletariat. The rural bourgeoisie, or kulaks, conduct commodity economy on the basis of the use of wage labor, the exploitation of permanent farm laborers, and still more of day laborers and other temporary laborers hired for seasonal field work. The kulaks concentrate in their hands a considerable share of the land, including rented land, draft animals, and agricultural products. In the hands of the kulaks there are also enterprises for the processing of raw materials, mills, threshing machines, pedigree producers, etc. Kulaks usually also act as village usurers and shopkeepers. All this serves as a means of exploiting the poor peasants and a large part of the middle peasantry. The agricultural proletariat is a mass of farm laborers, deprived of the means of production and exploited by the landlords and the rural bourgeoisie. The main source of subsistence of the agricultural proletarian is the sale of his labor power. A typical representative of the rural proletariat is the wage worker with an allotment. The insignificant size of the farm on a piece of land, the absence of draft animals and implements, inevitably compels such a peasant to sell his labor power. The agricultural proletariat is joined by the rural poor. The poor peasant has a small plot of land and a small number of livestock. Such a peasant does not have enough bread of his own. The money he needs for food, clothing, housekeeping, and taxes, he is forced to earn to a large extent by hired work. Such a peasant has half ceased to be a proprietor and is a rural semi-proletarian. The standard of living of the poor man, like that of the rural proletarian, is very low, and is inferior even to that of the industrial worker. The development of capitalism in agriculture leads to an ever-increasing number of the ranks of the rural proletariat and the poor peasants. An intermediate link between the rural bourgeoisie and the poor peasants is the middle peasantry. The middle peasantry manages its economy on the basis of its own means of production and personal labor. The labor of the middle peasant on his farm ensures the maintenance of his family only under favorable conditions. Hence the instability of the position of the middle peasant. In its social relations this group oscillates between the higher, to which it gravitates and into which only a small fortunate minority succeeds, and the lower, into which it is pushed by the whole course of social evolution. 27. The middle peasantry is being ruined, washed out. Capitalist relations in the agriculture of the bourgeois countries are intertwined with the survivals of serfdom. The bourgeoisie, having come to power, did not abolish large-scale feudal landownership in most countries. The landlord economy gradually adapted itself to capitalism. The peasantry, freed from serfdom but deprived of a considerable part of its land, was suffocated by a shortage of land. It was forced to lease land from landlords on enslaving terms. In Russia, for example, after the reform of 1861, the most common form of exploitation of peasants by landlords was labor, in which the peasant was forced to work in the landlord's economy for renting land or paying off an enslaving loan, using his own means of production, draft power and primitive implements. The disintegration of the peasantry undermined the foundations of the landlord economy, which was carried out by means of labor and exploitation of the economically dependent peasant and was based on backward technology. A well-to-do peasant had the opportunity to rent land for money and therefore did not need to rent indentured servitude for work. The poor man was also unfit for the labor system, but for a different reason. Without the means of production, he turned into a wage worker. The landlord could employ mainly the middle peasantry for work. But the development of commodity farming and commercial agriculture, ruining the middle peasantry, undermined the labor system of farming. The landlords expanded the use of hired labor, which is more productive than the labor of the dependent peasant. The importance of the capitalist system of economy increased, while that of the labor system declined. However, labor, as a direct survival of Corvée, 27 volts. I. Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Essays, Volume 3, p. 148. Persisted for a long time along with the capitalist system of economy. Formation of an internal market for capitalist industry. With the development of capitalism in industry and agriculture, the process of formation of the domestic market took place. Already in the manufacturing period, a number of new branches of industrial production arose. Various types of industrial processing of agricultural raw materials were separated from agriculture one after another. With the growth of industry, the demand for agricultural products increased more and more. In this regard, the market expanded. Areas that specialized in the production of, for example, cotton, flax, sugar beets, as well as in the breeding of productive livestock, showed demand for bread. Agriculture increased the demand for a variety of industrial products. The internal market for capitalist industry is created by the very development of capitalism and by the disintegration of the small commodity producers. The separation of the direct producer from the means of production, i.e., his expropriation, marking the transition from simple commodity production to capitalist production, and constituting a necessary condition for this transition, creates the home market. 28. The process of creating an internal market was two-sided. On the one hand, the urban and rural bourgeoisie demanded the means of production, improved tools, machines, raw materials, etc., necessary for the expansion of existing capitalist enterprises and the construction of new 28v. I. Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Works, Volume 3, pp. 45-46. 1. The bourgeoisie's demand for consumer goods grew. On the other hand, the increase in the number of the industrial and agricultural proletariat, which was inseparably linked with the disintegration of the peasantry, was accompanied by an increase in the demand for the commodities which are the means of subsistence of the worker. Manufactures based on primitive technology and manual labor were unable to meet the growing demand for manufactured goods. There was an economic need for the transition to large-scale machine production. Brief conclusions. 1. The first stage in the development of capitalist production in industry is capitalist industrial cooperation, which arises from small-scale commodity production. Capitalist simple cooperation is a form of production based on the exploitation by an individual capitalist of a more or less considerable number of wage laborers employed at the same time, who perform homogeneous work. Capitalist simple cooperatives ensured economy in the means of production, created new social productive force of labor, reduced labor costs per unit of output. The results of the growth of the productive power of social labor were appropriated by the capitalists free of charge. 2. The second stage in the development of capitalist production in industry is manufacture. Manufacture is large-scale capitalist production based on manual technique and the division of labor among wage workers. The manufacturing division of labor greatly increased the productivity of labor, but at the same time it disfigured the wage laborer, condemning him to an extremely one-sided development. The manufactory created the necessary prerequisites for the transition to a large-scale machine industry. 3. The development of commodity production leads to the disintegration of the peasantry. A small upper stratum of the countryside goes over to the ranks of the bourgeoisie. Large masses of the peasantry are passing over to the ranks of the proletariat, both urban and rural. The mass of the poor is growing. The vast intermediate stratum of the middle peasantry is ruined. The disintegration of the peasantry undermines the foundations of the labor system. The landlords are increasingly passing from corvée to capitalist farming. 4. The internal market is created by the development of capitalism itself. The expansion of the domestic market meant an increase in demand for the means of production and the means of subsistence. Manufacture, based on backward technology and manual labor, was unable to satisfy the increased demand for manufactured goods. There was a need to switch to the machine industry. Chapter V. The Machine Age of Capitalism. Transition from manufacture to machine industry. As long as production was based on manual labor, as it was in the manufacturing period, capitalism could not bring about a radical transformation of the entire economic life of society. This transformation took place with the transition from manufacture to machine industry, which began to emerge in the last third of the 18th century and spread to the most important capitalist countries of Europe and the United States during the 19th century. Large-scale machine industry is the third and highest stage in the development of capitalist production. The transition from manufactory to machine industry meant a complete technical revolution in production. The material and technical basis of this revolution was the machine. Every developed machine consists of three parts. 1. The engine machine, 2. The transmission mechanism, and 3. The working machine. The machine engine acts as the driving force of the entire mechanism. It either generates its own motive power, e.g., a steam engine, or receives it from without, from some ready-made force of nature, e.g., a water wheel driven by the force of falling water. The transmission mechanism consists of all kinds of devices, transmissions, gears, belts, electric drives, etc., that regulate the movement, change its shape if necessary, for example, turn it from a straight line to a circular one. Distribute it and transfer it to the working machine. Both the motor machine and the transmission mechanism serve to drive the working machine.
The working machine acts directly on the object of labor and makes the necessary changes in it in accordance with the set purpose. If we look more closely at the working machine, we will find, though often in a very modified form, in general the same tools that are used in manual labor. But in all cases these are no longer tools of manual labor, but tools mechanisms, mechanical tools. The working machine was the starting point of the revolution which led to the replacement of manufacture by machine production. After the invention of mechanical tools, there were fundamental changes in the design of propulsion and transmission mechanisms. In its insatiable pursuit of profit, capital has found in the machine a powerful means of increasing the productivity of labor. In the first place, the use of machines operating simultaneously with many instruments freed the production process from the narrow framework caused by the limitations of the human organs. Secondly, the use of machines made it possible for the first time to use in the process of production enormous new sources of energy, the motive power of steam, gas and electricity. Thirdly, the use of machinery has made it possible for capital to put science at the service of production, which expands man's power over nature and opens up ever new possibilities for increasing the productivity of labor. On the basis of large-scale machine industry, the dominance of the capitalist mode of production was established,